Section 41 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 12. Spring, summer, and fall came and went, with Eugene and Angela first in Alexandria and then in Blackwood. In suffering this nervous breakdown and being compelled to leave New York, Eugene missed some of the finest fruits of his artistic efforts, for Monsieur Charles, as well as a number of other people, were interested in him and were prepared to entertain him in an interesting and conspicuous way. He could have gone out a great deal, but his mental state was such that he was poor company for anyone. He was exceedingly morbid, inclined to discuss gloomy subjects, to look on life as exceedingly sad, and to believe that people generally were evil. Lust, dishonesty, selfishness, envy, hypocrisy, slander, hate, theft, adultery, murder, dementia, insanity, inanity, these and death and decay occupied his thoughts. There was no light anywhere, only a storm of evil and death. These ideas, coupled with his troubles with Angela, the fact that he could not work, the fact that he felt he had made a matrimonial mistake, the fact that he feared he might die or go crazy, made a terrible and agonizing winter for him. Angela's attitude, while sympathetic enough, once the first storm of feeling was over, was nevertheless involved with a substratum of criticism. While she said nothing, agreed that she would forget, Eugene had the consciousness all the while that she wasn't forgetting, that she was secretly reproaching him, and that she was looking for new manifestations of weakness in this direction, expecting them, and on the alert to prevent them. The springtime in Alexandria, opening as it did shortly after they reached there, was in a way a source of relief to Eugene. He had decided for the time being to give up trying to work, to give up his idea of going either to London or Chicago, and merely rest. Perhaps it was true that he was tired. He didn't feel that way. He couldn't sleep and he couldn't work, but he felt brisk enough. It was only because he couldn't work that he was miserable. Still, he decided to try sheer idleness. Perhaps that would revive his wonderful art for him. Meantime, he speculated ceaselessly on the time he was losing, the celebrities he was missing, the places he was not seeing. Oh, London, London! If he could only do that! Mr. and Mrs. Witla were immensely pleased to have their boy back with them again. Being in their way simple, unsophisticated people, they could not understand how their son's health could have undergone such a sudden reverse. "I never saw Gene looking so bad in all his life," observed Witla père to his wife the day Eugene arrived. "His eyes are so sunken. What in the world do you suppose is ailing him?" "How should I know?" replied his wife, who was greatly distressed over her boy. "I suppose he's just tired out, that's all. He'll probably be all right after he rests a while. Don't let on that you think he's looking out of sorts. Just pretend that he's all right. What do you think of his wife?" "She appears to be a very nice little woman," replied Witla. "She's certainly devoted to him. I never thought Eugene would marry just that type, but he's the judge. I suppose people thought that I would never marry anybody like you either," he added jokingly. "Yes, you did make a terrible mistake," jested his wife in return. "You worked awfully hard to make it." I was young. You want to remember that," retorted Witla. "I didn't know much in those days." "You don't appear to know much better yet," she replied, "do you?" He smiled and patted her on the back. "Well, anyhow, I'll have to make the best of it, won't I? It's too late now." "It certainly is," replied his wife. Eugene and Angela were given his old room on the second floor, commanding a nice view of the yard and the street corner, and they settled down to spend what Witla's parents hoped would be months of peaceful days. It was a curious sensation to Eugene to find himself back here in Alexandria, looking out upon the peaceful neighborhood in which he had been raised. The trees, the lawn, the hammock replaced several times since he had left, but still in its accustomed place. The thought of the little lakes and the small creek winding about the town were a comfort to him. He could go fishing now and boating, and there were some interesting walks here and there. He began to amuse himself by going fishing the first week, but it was still a little cold, and he decided for the time being to confine himself to walking. Days of this kind grow, as a rule, quickly monotonous. To a man of Eugene's turn of mind, there was so little in Alexandria to entertain him. After London and Paris, Chicago and New York, the quiet streets of his old home town were a joke. He visited the office of the Appeal, but both Jonas Lyle and Caleb Williams had gone, the former to St. Louis, the latter to Bloomington. Old Benjamin Burgess, his sister's husband's father, was unchanged except in the matter of years. He told Eugene that he was thinking of running for Congress in the next campaign. The Republican organization owed it to him. His son Henry, Sylvia's husband, had become a treasurer of the local bank. He was working as patiently and quietly as ever, going to church Sundays, going to Chicago occasionally on business, consulting with farmers and businessmen about small loans. He was a close student of the several banking journals of the country, and seemed to be doing very well financially. Sylvia had little to say of how he was getting along. Having lived with him for 11 years, she had become somewhat closed-mouthed like himself. Eugene could not help smiling at the lean, slippered subtlety of the man, young as he was. He was so quiet, so conservative, so intent on all the little things which make a conventionally successful life. Like a cabinet maker, he was busy inlaying the little pieces which would eventually make the perfect whole. Angela took up the household work, which Mrs. Witla grudgingly consented to share with her with a will. She liked to work, and would put the house in order while Mrs. Witla was washing the dishes after breakfast. She would make special pies and cakes for Eugene when she could without giving offense, and she tried to conduct herself so that Mrs. Witla would like her. She did not think so much of the Witla household. It wasn't so much better than her own, hardly as good. Still, it was Eugene's birthplace, and for that reason important. There was a slight divergence of viewpoint, though, between his mother and herself over the nature of life and how to live it. Mrs. Witla was of an easier, more friendly outlook on life than Angela. She liked to take things as they came without much worry, while Angela was of a naturally worrying disposition. The two had one very human failing in common. They could not work with anyone else at anything. Each preferred to do all that was to be done rather than share it at all. Both being so anxious to be conciliatory for Eugene's sake and for permanent peace in the family, there was small chance for any disagreement, for neither was without tact. But there was just a vague hint of something in the air, that Angela was a little hard and selfish on Mrs. Witla's part, that Mrs. Witla was just the least bit secretive or shy or distant from Angela's point of view. All was serene and lovely on the surface, however, with many "won't you let me's" and "please do now's" on both sides. Mrs. Witla, being so much older, was of course calmer, and in the family seat of dignity and peace. To be able to sit about in a chair, lie in a hammock, stroll in the woods and country fields, and be perfectly happy in idle contemplation and loneliness, requires an exceptional talent for just that sort of thing. Eugene once fancied he had it, as did his parents, but since he had heard the call of fame, he could never be still any more. And just at this time he was not in need of solitude and idle contemplation, but of diversion and entertainment. He needed companionship of the right sort, gaiety, sympathy, enthusiasm. Angela had some of this when she was not troubled about anything. His parents, his sister, his old acquaintances had a little more to offer. They could not, however, be forever talking to him or paying him attention, and beyond them there was nothing. The town had no resources. Eugene would walk the long country roads with Angela, or go boating or fishing sometimes, but still he was lonely. He would sit on the porch or in the hammock and think of what he had seen in London and Paris. How he might be at work. St. Paul's in a mist, the Thames Embankment, Piccadilly, Blackfriars Bridge, the muck of Whitechapel and the East End. How he wished he was out of all this and painting them. If he could only paint. He rigged up a studio in his father's barn, using a north loft door for light, and essayed certain things from memory, but there was no making anything come out right. He had this fixed belief, which was a notion purely, that there was always something wrong. Angela, his mother, his father, whom he occasionally asked for an opinion, might protest that it was beautiful or wonderful, but he did not believe it. After a few altering ideas of this kind, under the influences of which he would change and change and change things, he would find himself becoming wild in his feelings, enraged at his condition, intensely despondent and sorry for himself. "Well," he would say, throwing down his brush, "I shall simply have to wait until I come out of this. I can't do anything this way." Then he would walk or read or row on the lakes or play solitaire or listen to Angela playing on the piano that his father had installed for Myrtle long since. All the time, though, he was thinking of his condition, what he was missing, how the gay world was surging on rapidly elsewhere, how long it would be before he got well, if ever. He talked of going to Chicago and trying his hand at scenes there, but Angela persuaded him to rest for a while longer. In June she promised him they would go to Blackwood for the summer, coming back here in the fall if he wished, or going on to New York or staying in Chicago, just as he felt about it. Now he needed rest. "Eugene will probably be all right by then," Angela volunteered to his mother, "and he can make up his mind whether he wants to go to Chicago or London." She was very proud of her ability to talk of where they would go and what they would do. End of section 41. Section 42 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 13. If it had not been for the lurking hope of some fresh exciting experience with a woman, he would have been unconscionably lonely. As it was, this thought with him, quite as the confirmed drunkard's thought of whiskey, buoyed him up, kept him from despairing utterly, gave his mind the only diversion it had from the ever-present thought of failure. If by chance he should meet some truly beautiful girl, gay, enticing, who would fall in love with him, that would be happiness. Only Angela was constantly watching him these days, and besides, more girls would simply mean that his condition would be aggravated. Yet so powerful was the illusion of desire, the sheer animal magnetism of beauty, that when it came near him in the form of a lovely girl of his own temperamental inclinations, he could not resist it. One look into an inviting eye, one glance at a face whose outlines were soft and delicate, full of that subtle suggestion of youth and health which is so characteristic of girlhood, and the spell was cast. It was as though the very form of the face, without will or intention on the part of the possessor, acted hypnotically upon its beholder. The Arabians believed in the magic power of the word abracadabra to cast a spell. For Eugene, the form of a woman's face and body was quite as powerful. While he and Angela were in Alexandria from February to May, he met one night at his sister's house a girl who, from the point of view of the beauty which he admired and to which he was so susceptible, was extremely hypnotic, and who, for the ease and convenience of a flirtation, was very favorably situated. She was the daughter of a traveling man, George Roth by name, whose wife, the child's mother, was dead, but who lived with his sister in an old tree-shaded house on the edge of Green Lake, not far from the spot where Eugene had once attempted to caress his first love, Stella Appleton. Frieda was the girl's name. She was extremely attractive, not more than 18 years of age, with large, clear blue eyes, a wealth of yellowish brown hair, and a plump but shapely figure. She was a graduate of the local high school, well developed for her years, bright, rosy cheeked, vivacious, and with a great deal of natural intelligence which attracted the attention of Eugene at once. Normally, he was extremely fond of a natural, cheerful, laughing disposition. In his present state he was abnormally so. The girl and her foster mother had heard of him a long time since, through his parents and his sister, whom they knew well and whom they visited frequently. George Roth had moved here since Eugene had first left for Chicago, and because he was so much on the road, he had not seen him since. Frieda, on all his previous visits, had been too young to take an interest in men, but now at this age, when she was just blossoming into womanhood, her mind was fixed on them. She did not expect to be interested in Eugene because she knew he was married, but because of his reputation as an artist she was curious about him. Everybody knew who he was. The local papers had written up his success and published his portrait. Frieda expected to see a man of about 40, stern and sober. Instead, she met a smiling youth of 29, rather gaunt and hollow-eyed, but none the less attractive for that. Eugene, with Angela's approval, still affected a loose flowing tie, a soft turn-down collar, brown corduroy suits as a rule, the coat cut with a belt, shooting jacket fashion, a black iron ring of very curious design upon one of his fingers, and a soft hat. His hands were very thin and white, his skin pale. Frieda, rosy, as thoughtless as a butterfly, charmingly clothed in a dress of blue linen, laughing, afraid of him because of his reputation, attracted his attention at once. She was like all the young, healthy, laughing girls he had ever known, delightful. He wished he were single again, that he might fall into a jesting conversation with her. She seemed inclined to be friendly from the first. Angela being present, however, and Frieda's foster mother, it was necessary for him to be circumspect and distant. The latter, Sylvia and Angela, talked of art and listened to Angela's descriptions of Eugene's eccentricities, idiosyncrasies, and experiences, which were a never failing source of interest to the common run of mortals whom they met. Eugene would sit by in a comfortable chair with a weary, genial, or indifferent look on his face, as his mood happened to be. Tonight he was bored and a little indifferent in his manner. No one here interested him save this girl, the beauty of whose face nourished his secret dreams. He longed to have such spirit of youth near him always. Why could not women remain young? While they were laughing and talking, Eugene picked up a copy of Howard Pyle's Knights of the Round Table, with its warm, heavy illustrations of Arthurian heroes and heroines, and began to study the stately and exaggerated characteristics of the various characters. Sylvia had purchased it for her 7-year-old boy, Jack, asleep upstairs, but Frieda had read it in her girlhood a few years before. She had been moving restlessly about, conscious of an interest in Eugene, but not knowing how to find an opportunity for conversation. His smile, which he sometimes directed toward her, was to her entrancing. "Oh, I read that," she said, when she saw him looking at it. She had drifted to a position not far behind his chair and near one of the windows. She pretended to be looking out at first, but now began to talk to him. "I used to be crazy about every one of the knights and ladies, Sir Lancelot, Sir Galahad, Sir Tristram, Sir Gawaine, Queen Guinevere." "Did you ever hear of Sir Bluff?" he asked teasingly, "or Sir Snuff, or Sir Dub?" He looked at her with a mocking light of humor in his eyes. "Oh, there aren't such people," laughed Frieda, surprised at the titles, but tickled at the thought of them. "Don't let him mock you, Frieda," put in Angela, who was pleased at the girl's gaiety and glad that Eugene had found someone in whom he could take an interest. She did not fear the simple Western type of girl like Frieda and her own sister Marietta. They were franker, more kindly, better intentioned than the Eastern studio type, and besides, they did not consider themselves superior. She was playing the role of the condescending leader here. "Certainly there are," replied Eugene solemnly, addressing Frieda. "They are the new Knights of the Round Table. Haven't you ever heard of that book?" "No, I haven't," answered Frieda gaily. "And there isn't any such. You're just teasing me." "Teasing you? Why, I wouldn't think of such a thing. And there is such a book. It's published by Harper and Brothers and is called The New Knights of the Round Table. You simply haven't heard of it, that's all." Frieda was impressed. She did not know whether to believe him or not. She opened her eyes in a curiously inquiring girlish way, which appealed to Eugene strongly. He wished he were free to kiss her pretty red, thoughtlessly parted lips. Angela herself was faintly doubtful as to whether he was speaking of a real book or not. "Sir Stuff is a very famous knight," he went on, "and so is Sir Bluff. They are inseparable companions in the book. As for Sir Dub and Sir Hack and the Lady Dope—" "Oh, hush, Eugene," called Angela gaily. "Just listen to what he's telling Frieda," she remarked to Miss Roth. "You mustn't mind him, though. He's always teasing someone. Why didn't you raise him better, Sylvia?" she asked of Eugene's sister. "Oh, don't ask me. We never could do anything with Gene. I never knew he had much jesting in him until he came back this time." "They're very wonderful," they heard him telling Frieda. "All fine, rosy gentlemen and ladies." Frieda was impressed by this charming, good-natured man. His spirit was evidently as youthful and gay as her own. She sat before him, looking into his smiling eyes, while he teased her about this, that, and the other foible of youth. Who were her sweethearts? How did she make love? How many boys lined up to see her come out of church on Sunday? He knew. "I bet they look like a line of soldiers on dress parade," he volunteered, "all with nice new ties and clean pocket handkerchiefs and their shoes polished and—" "Oh, ha, ha!" laughed Frieda. The idea appealed to her immensely. She started giggling and bantering with him, and their friendship was definitely sealed. She thought he was delightful. End of section 42. Section 43 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 14. The opportunity for further meetings seemed to come about quite naturally. The Witla boathouse, where the family kept one small boat, was at the foot of the Roth lawn, reached by a slightly used lane which came down that side of the house, and also by a grape arbor which concealed the lake from the lower end of the house and made a sheltered walk to the waterside, at the end of which was a weather-beaten wooden bench. Eugene came here sometimes to get the boat to row or to fish. On several occasions Angela accompanied him, but she did not care much for rowing or fishing, and was perfectly willing that he should go alone if he wanted to. There was also the friendship of Miss Roth for Mr. and Mrs. Witla, which occasionally brought her and Frieda to the house, and Frieda came from time to time to his studio in the barn to see him paint. Because of her youth and innocence, Angela thought very little of her presence there, which struck Eugene as extremely fortunate. He was interested in her charms, anxious to make love to her in a philandering sort of way, without intending to do her any harm. It struck him as a little curious that he should find her living so near the spot where once, upon a winter's night, he had made love to Stella. There was something not unlike Stella about her, though she was softer, more whole, soulfully genial, and pliable to his moods. He saw her one day, when he went for his boat, standing out in the yard, and she came down to the waterside to greet him. "Well," he said, smiling at her fresh morning appearance, and addressing her with that easy familiarity which he knew how to take youth and life generally, "we're looking bright as a butterfly. I don't suppose we butterflies have to work very hard, do we?" "Oh, don't we?" replied Frieda. "That's all you know." "Well, I don't know, that's true. But perhaps one of these butterflies will tell me. Now you, for instance." Frieda smiled. She scarcely knew how to take him, but she thought he was delightful. She hadn't the faintest conception either of the depth or subtlety of his nature or of the genial, kindly inconstancy of it. She only saw him as a handsome, smiling man, not at all too old, witty, good-natured, here by the bright green waters of this lake, pulling out his boat. He looked so cheerful to her, so carefree. She had him indissolubly mixed in her impressions with the freshness of the ground, the newness of the grass, the brightness of the sky, the chirping of the birds, and even the little scintillating ripples on the water. "Butterflies never work, that I know," he said, refusing to take her seriously. "They just dance around in the sunlight and have a good time. Did you ever talk to a butterfly about that?" Frieda merely smiled at him. He pushed his boat into the water, holding it lightly by a rope, got down a pair of oars from the rack and stepped into it. Then he stood there looking at her. "Have you lived in Alexandria long?" he asked. "About 8 years now." "Do you like it?" "Sometimes, not always. I wish we lived in Chicago." "Oh," she sniffed, turning up her pretty nose. "Isn't that lovely?" She was smelling some odor of flowers blown from the garden. "Yes, I get it too. Geraniums, isn't it? They're blooming here, I see. A day like this sets me crazy." He sat down in his boat and put his oars in place. "Well, I have to go and try my luck for whales. Wouldn't you like to go fishing?" "I would, all right," said Frieda, "only Aunt wouldn't let me. I think I'd just love to go. It's lots of fun catching fish." "Yes, catching fish," laughed Eugene. "Well, I'll bring you a nice little shark, one that bites. Would you like that? Down in the Atlantic Ocean they have sharks that bite and bark. They come up out of the water at night and bark like a dog." "Oh, dear, how funny," giggled Frieda, and Eugene began slowly rolling his boat lakeward. "Be sure you bring me a nice fish," she called. "Be sure you're here to get it when I come back," he answered. He saw her with the lattice of spring leaves behind her, the old house showing pleasantly on its rise of ground. Some house martins turning in the morning sky. "What a lovely girl," he thought. "She's beautiful, as fresh as a flower. That is the one great thing in this world, the beauty of girlhood." He came back after a time, expecting to find her, but her foster mother had sent her on an errand. He felt a keen sense of disappointment. There were other meetings after this. Once on a day when he came back practically fishless, and she laughed at him. Once when he saw her sunning her hair on the back porch after she had washed it, and she came down to stand under the trees near the water, looking like a naiad. He wished then he could take her in his arms, but he was a little uncertain of her and of himself. Once she came to his studio in the barn to bring him a piece of leftover dough which his mother had turned on the top of the stove. "Eugene used to be crazy about that when he was a boy," his mother had remarked. "Oh, let me take it to him," said Frieda gaily, gleeful over the idea of the adventure. "That's a good idea," said Angela innocently. "Wait, I'll put it on this saucer." Frieda took it and ran. She found Eugene staring oddly at his canvas, his face curiously dark. When her head came above the loft floor, his expression changed immediately. His guileless, kindly smile returned. "Guess what?" she said, pulling a little white apron she had on over the dish. "Strawberries?" They were in season. "Oh, no." "Peaches and cream?" "Where would we get peaches now?" "At the grocery store." "I'll give you one more guess." "Angel cake." He was fond of that, and Angela occasionally made it. "Your guesses are all gone. You can't have any." He reached out his hand, but she drew back. He followed, and she laughed. "No, no, you can't have any now." He caught her soft arm and drew her close to him. "Sure I can't?" Their faces were close together. She looked into his eyes for a moment, then dropped her lashes. Eugene's brain swirled with a sense of her beauty. It was the old talesman. He covered her sweet lips with his own, and she yielded feverishly. "There now, eat your dough," she exclaimed when he let her go, pushing it shamefacedly toward him. She was flustered, so much so that she failed to jest about it. "What would Mrs. Witla think," she added, "if she could see us?" Eugene paused solemnly and listened. He was afraid of Angela. "I've always liked this stuff ever since I was a boy," he said in an offhand way. "So your mother said," replied Frieda, somewhat recovered. "Let me see what you're painting." She came round to his side and he took her hand. "I'll have to go now," she said wisely. "They'll be expecting me back." Eugene speculated on the intelligence of girls, at least on that of those he liked. Somehow they were all wise under these circumstances, cautious. He could see that instinctively Frieda was prepared to protect him and herself. She did not appear to be suffering from any shock from this revelation. Rather, she was inclined to make the best of it. He folded her in his arms again. "You're the angel cake and the strawberries and the peaches and cream," he said. "Don't," she pleaded. "Don't. I have to go now." When he released her, she ran quickly down the stairs, giving him a swift, parting smile. So Frieda was added to the list of his conquests, and he pondered over it gravely. If Angela could have seen this scene, what a storm there would have been! If she ever became conscious of what was going on, what a period of wrath there would be! It would be terrible. After her recent discovery of his letters, he hated to think of that. Still, this bliss of caressing youth, was it not worth any price? To have a bright, joyous girl of 18 put her arms about you, could you risk too much for it? The world said one life, one love. Could he accede to that? Could any one woman satisfy him? Could Frieda, if he had her? He did not know. He did not care to think about it. Only this walking in a garden of flowers, how delicious it was. This having a rose to your lips. Angela saw nothing of this attraction for some time. She was not prepared yet to believe, poor little depender on the conventions as she understood them, that the world was full of plots and counterplots, snares, pitfalls, and gins. The way of the faithful and well-meaning woman in marriage should be simple and easy. She should not be harassed by the uncertainty of affection, infelicities of temper, indifference, or infidelity. If she worked hard, as Angela was trying to do, trying to be a good wife, saving, serving, making a sacrifice of her time and services and moods and wishes for her husband's sake, why shouldn't he do the same for her? She knew of no double standard of virtue. If she had, she would not have believed in it. Her parents had raised her to see marriage in a different light. Her father was faithful to her mother. Eugene's father was faithful to his wife. That was perfectly plain. Her brothers-in-law were faithful to her sisters. Eugene's brothers-in-law were faithful to his sisters. Why should not Eugene be faithful to her? So far, of course, she had no evidence to the contrary. He probably was faithful and would remain so. He had said so. But this pre-matrimonial philandering of his looked very curious. It was an astonishing thing that he could have deceived her so. She would never forget it. He was a genius, to be sure. The world was waiting to hear what he had to say. He was a great man and should associate with great men, or failing that, should not want to associate with anyone at all. It was ridiculous for him to be running around after silly women. She thought of this and decided to do her best to prevent it. The seat of the mighty was in her estimation the place for Eugene, with her in the foreground as a faithful and conspicuous acolyte, swinging the censer of praise and delight. The days went on, and various little meetings, some accidental, some premeditated, took place between Eugene and Frieda. There was one afternoon when he was at his sister's, and she came there to get a pattern for her foster mother from Sylvia. She lingered for over an hour, during which time Eugene had opportunities to kiss her a dozen times. The beauty of her eyes and her smile haunted him after she was gone. There was another time when he saw her at dusk near his boathouse and kissed her in the shadow of the sheltering grape arbor. In his own home There were clandestine moments, and in his studio, the barn loft, for Frieda made occasion a few times to come to him, a promise to make a sketch of her being the excuse. Angela resented this, but she could not prevent it. In the main, Frieda exhibited the curious patience in love which women so customarily exhibit and which a man can never understand. She could wait for her own to come to her, for him to find her, while he, with that curious avidness of the male in love, burned as a fed fire to see her. He was jealous of the little innocent walks she took with boys she knew. The fact that it was necessary for her to be away from him was a great deprivation. The fact that he was married to Angela was a horrible disaster. He would look at Angela when she was with him, preventing him from his freedom in love, with almost calculated hate in his eyes. Why had he married her? As for Frieda, when she was near, and he could not draw near her, his eyes followed her movements with a yearning, devouring glance. He was fairly beside himself with anguish under the spell of her beauty. Frieda had no notion of the consuming flame she had engendered. It was a simple thing to walk home with her from the post office, quite accidentally, on several occasions. It was a fortuitous thing that Anna Roth should invite Angela and himself, as well as his father and mother, to her house to dinner. On one occasion, when Frieda was visiting at the Witla homestead, Angela thought Frieda stepped away from Eugene in a curiously disturbed manner when she came into the parlor. She was not sure. Frieda hung round him in a good-natured way most of the time when various members of the family were present. She wondered if by any chance he was making love to her, but she could not prove it. She tried to watch them from then on, but Eugene was so subtle, Frieda so circumspect, that she never did obtain any direct testimony. Nevertheless, before they left Alexandria, there was a weeping scene over this, hysterical, tempestuous, in which she accused him of making love to Frieda, he denying it stoutly. "If it wasn't for your relative's sake," she declared, "I would accuse her to her face, here before your eyes. She couldn't dare deny it." "Oh, you're crazy," said Eugene. "You're the most suspicious woman I ever knew. Good Lord, can't I look at a woman any more? This little girl, can't I even be nice to her?" "Nice to her! Nice to her! I know how you're nice to her. I can see, I can feel. Oh, God, why can't you give me a faithful husband?" "Oh, cut it out," demanded Eugene defiantly. "You're always watching. I can't turn around but you have your eye on me. I can tell. Well, you go ahead and watch. That's all the good it will do you. I'll give you some real reason for watching one of these days. You make me tired." "Oh, hear how he talks to me," moaned Angela. "And we're only married 1 year. Oh, Eugene, how can you? Have you no pity, no shame, here in your own home, too? Oh, oh, oh." To Eugene such hysterics were maddening. He could not understand how anyone should want or find it possible to carry on in this fashion. He was lying out of the whole cloth about Frieda, but Angela didn't know, and he knew she didn't know. All these tantrums were based on suspicion. If she would do this on a mere suspicion, what would she not do when she had a proved cause? Still by her tears she as yet had the power of rousing his sympathies and awakening his sense of shame. Her sorrow made him slightly ashamed of his conduct, or rather sorry, for the tougher nature was constantly presenting itself. Her suspicions made the further pursuit of his love quest practically impossible. Secretly he had already cursed the day he had married her, for Frieda's face was ever before him, a haunting lure to love and desire. In this hour life looked terribly sad to him. He couldn't help feeling that all the perfect things one might seek or find were doomed to the searing breath of an inimical fate. Ashes of roses, that was all life had to offer. Dead Sea fruit turning to ashes upon the lips. Oh, Frieda, Frieda! Oh, youth, youth! That there should dance before him for evermore an unattainable desire, the holy grail of beauty. Oh, life! Oh, death! Which was really better, waking or sleeping? If he could only have Frieda now, it would be worth living. But without her... End of section 43. Section 44 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 15. The weakness of Eugene was that he was prone in each of these new conquests to see for the time being the sum and substance of bliss, to rise rapidly in the scale of uncontrollable exaggerated affection, until he felt that here and nowhere else, now and in this particular form, was ideal happiness. He had been in love with Stella, with Margaret, with Ruby, with Angela, with Christina, and now with Frieda. Quite in this way, and it had taught him nothing as yet concerning love except that it was utterly delightful. He wondered at times how it was that the formation of a particular face could work this spell. There was plain magic in the curl of a lock of hair, the whiteness or roundness of a forehead, the shapeliness of a nose or ear, the arched redness of full-blown petal lips, the cheek, the chin, the eye. In combination with these things, how did they work this witchery? The tragedies to which he laid himself open by yielding to these spells, he never stopped to think of them. It is a question whether the human will of itself alone ever has cured or ever can cure any human weakness. Tendencies are subtle things. They are involved in the chemistry of one's being, and those who delve in the mysteries of biology frequently find that curious anomaly, a form of minute animal life, born to be the prey of another form of animal life, chemically and physically attracted to its own disaster. Thus, to quote Calkin, some protozoa are apparently limited to special kinds of food. The slipper animal, Paramecium, and the bell animal, Vorticella, live on certain kinds of bacteria, and many others which live upon smaller protozoa seem to have a marked affinity for certain kinds. I have watched one of these creatures, Actinobolus, lie perfectly quiet while hundreds of bacteria and smaller kinds of protozoa bumped against it, until a certain variety, Halteria grandinella, came near, when a minute dart or trochocyst attached to a relatively long thread was launched. The victim was invariably hit, and after a short struggle was drawn in and devoured. The results of many experiments indicate that apparently willful selection in these cases is the inevitable action of definite chemical and physical laws which the individual organism can no more change than it can change the course of gravitation. The killing dart mentioned above is called out by the particular kind of prey with the irresistible attraction of an iron filing for a magnet. Eugene did not know of these curious biological experiments at this time, but he suspected that these attractions were deeper than human will. He thought at times that he ought to resist his impulses. At other times he asked himself why. If his treasure was in this and he lost it by resistance, what had he? A sense of personal purity? It did not appeal to him. The respect of his fellow citizens? He believed that most of his fellow citizens were whited sepulchres. What good did their hypocritical respect do him? Justice to others? Others were not concerned, or should not be, in the natural affinity which might manifest itself between two people. That was for them to settle. Besides, there was very little justice in the world. As for his wife, well, he had given her his word, but he had not done so willingly. Might one swear eternal fealty and abide by it when the very essence of nature was lack of fealty, inconsiderateness, destruction, change? A gloomy Hamlet, to be sure, asking, "Can honor set a leg?" A subtle Machiavelli, believing that might made right, sure that it was a matter of careful planning, not ethics, which brought success in this world, and yet one of the poorest planners in it. An anarchistic manifestation of selfishness, surely. But his additional plea was that He did not make his own mind, nor his emotions, nor anything else. And worst of all, he counseled himself that he was not seizing anything ruthlessly. He was merely accepting that which was thrust temptingly before him by fate. Hypnotic spells of this character, like contagion and fever, have their period of duration, their beginning, climax, and end. It is written that love is deathless, but this was not written of the body, nor does it concern the fevers of desire. The marriage of true minds, to which Shakespeare would admit no impediment, is of a different texture and has little sex in it. The friendship of Damon and Pythias was a marriage in the best sense, though it concerned two men. The possibilities of intellectual union between a man and a woman are quite the same. This is deathless in so far as it reflects the spiritual ideas of the universe, not more so. All else is illusion of short duration and vanishes in thin air. When the time came for Eugene to leave Alexandria, as he had originally wanted to do, he was not at all anxious to depart. Rather, it was an occasion of great suffering for him. He could not see any solution to the problem which confronted him in connection with Frieda's love for him. As a matter of fact, when he thought about it at all, he was quite sure that she did not understand or appreciate the nature of her affection for him or his for her. It had no basis in responsibility. It was one of those things born of thin air, sunlight, bright waters, the reflection of a bright room, things which are intangible and insubstantial. Eugene was not one who, if he thought anything at all about it, would persuade a girl to immorality for the mere sake of indulgence. His feelings were invariably compounded of finer things, love of companionship, love of beauty, a variable sense of the consequences which must ensue, not so much to him as to her, though he took himself into consideration. If she were not already experienced, and he had no method of protecting her, if he could not take her as his wife, or give her the advantages of his presence and financial support, secretly or openly, if he could not keep all their transactions a secret from the world, he was inclined to hesitate. He did not want to do anything rash, as much for her sake as for his. In this case, the fact that he could not marry her, that he could not reasonably run away with her, seeing that he was mentally sick and of uncertain financial condition, the fact that he was surrounded by home conditions which made it of the greatest importance that he should conduct himself circumspectly, weighed greatly with him. Nevertheless, a tragedy could easily have resulted here. If Frieda had been of a headstrong, unthinking nature, if Angela had been less watchful, morbid, appealing in her mood, if the family and town conditions had been less weighty, if Eugene had had health and ample means, he would probably have deserted Angela, taken Frieda to some European city. He dreamed of Paris in this connection, and found himself confronted later by an angry father or a growing realization that Frieda's personal charms were not the sum and substance of his existence, or both. George Roth, for all he was a traveling salesman, was a man of considerable determination. He might readily have ended the life of his daughter's betrayer, art, reputation, or no. He worshipped Frieda as the living image of his dead wife, and at best he would have been heartbroken. As it was, there was not much chance of this, for Eugene was not rash. He was too philosophic. Conditions might have arisen in which he would have shown the most foolhardy bravado, but not in his present state. There was not sufficient anguish in his own existence to drive him to action. He saw no clear way. So, in June, with Angela, he took his departure for Blackwood, pretending to her outward indifference as to his departure, but inwardly feeling that his whole life were coming to nothing. When he reached Blackwood, he was now naturally disgusted with the whole atmosphere of it. Frieda was not there. Alexandria, from having been the most wearisome side pool of aimless inactivity, had suddenly taken on all the characteristics of paradise. The little lakes, the quiet streets, the courthouse square, his sister's home, Frieda's home, his own home, had been once more invested for him with the radiance of romance, that intangible glory of feeling which can have no existence outside the illusion of love. Frieda's face was everywhere in it, her form, the look of her eyes. He could see nothing there now save the glory of Frieda. It was as though the hard, weary face of a barren landscape were suddenly bathed in the soft effulgence of a midnight moon. As for Blackwood, it was as lovely as ever, but he could not see it. The fact that his attitude had changed toward Angela for the time being made all the difference. He did not really hate her. He told himself that. She was not any different from that she had been. That was perfectly plain. The difference was in him. He really could not be madly in love with two people at once. He had entertained joint affections for Angela and Ruby, and Angela and Christina, but those were not the dominating fevers which this seemed to be. He could not for the time get the face of this girl out of his mind. He was sorry for Angela at moments, then, because of her insistence on his presence with her, on her being in his company, following him around as he put it, he hated her. Dear heaven, if he could only be free without injuring her. If he could only get loose. Think, at this moment he might be with Frieda, walking in the sun somewhere, rowing on the lake at Alexandria, holding her in his arms. He would never forget how she looked that first morning she came into his barn studio at home. How enticing she was the first night he saw her at Sylvia's. What a rotten mess living was, anyhow. And so he sat about in the hammock at the Blue homestead, or swung in a swing that old Jotham had since put up for Marietta's beau, or dreamed in a chair in the shade of the house, reading. He was dreary and lonely, with just one ambition in the world, Frieda. Meanwhile, as might be expected, his health was not getting any better. Instead of curing himself of those purely carnal expressions of passion which characterized his life with Angela, the latter went on unbroken. One would have thought that his passion for Frieda would have interrupted this, but for the presence of Angela, the comparatively enforced contact, her insistence on his attentions, broke down again and again the protecting barrier of distaste. Had he been alone, he would have led a chaste life until some new and available infatuation seized him. As it was, there was no refuge either from himself or Angela, and the at times almost nauseating relationship went on and on. Those of the Blue family who were in home or near it were delighted to see him. The fact that he had achieved such a great success as the papers had reported with his first exhibition and had not lost ground with the second. A very interesting letter had come from M. Charles saying that the Paris pictures would be shown in Paris in July, gave them a great estimate of him. Angela was a veritable queen in this home atmosphere. And as for Eugene, he was given the privilege of all geniuses to do as he pleased. On this occasion Eugene was the center of interest, though he appeared not to be, for his four solid Western brothers-in-law gave no indication that they thought he was unusual. He was not their type, banker, lawyer, grain merchant, and real estate dealer, but they felt proud of him just the same. He was different and at the same time natural, genial, modest, inclined to appear far more interested in their affairs than he really was. He would listen by the hour to the details of their affairs, political, financial, agricultural, social. The world was a curious compost to Eugene, and he was always anxious to find out how other people lived. He loved a good story, and while he rarely told one, he made a splendid audience for those who did. His eyes would sparkle, and his whole face light with the joy of the humor he felt. Through all this, the attention he was receiving, the welcome he was made to feel, the fact that his art interests were not yet dead, the Paris exhibition being the expiring breath of his original burst of force, he was nevertheless feeling the downward trend of his affairs most keenly. His mind was not right. That was surely true. His money affairs were getting worse, not better, for while he could hope for a few sales yet, the Paris pictures did not sell in New York. He was not certain that this would be the case. This homeward trip had cost him $200 of his $1,700, and there would be additional expenses if he went to Chicago as he planned in the fall. He could not live a single year on $1,500, scarcely more than 6 months, and he could not paint or illustrate anything new in his present state. Additional sales of the pictures of the 2 original exhibitions must be effected in a reasonable length of time, or he would find himself in hard straits. Meanwhile, Angela, who had obtained such a high estimate of his future by her experience in New York and Paris, was beginning to enjoy herself again, for after all, in her judgment, she seemed to be able to manage Eugene very well. He might have had some slight understanding with Frieda Roth. It couldn't have been much or she would have seen it, she thought, but she had managed to break it up. Eugene was cross, naturally, but that was due more to her quarreling than anything else. These storms of feeling on her part, not always premeditated, seemed very essential. Eugene must be made to understand that he was married now, that he could not look upon or run after girls as he had in the old days. She was well aware that he was considerably younger than she was in temperament, inclined to be exceedingly boyish, and this was apt to cause trouble anywhere. But if she watched over him, kept his attention fixed on her, everything would come out all right. And then there were all these other delightful qualities, his looks, his genial manner, his reputation, his talent. What a delightful thing it had become to announce herself as Mrs. Eugene Witla, and how those who knew about him sat up. Big people were his friends, artists admired him, common, homely, everyday people thought he was nice and considerate and able and very worth while. He was generally liked everywhere. What more could one want? Angela knew nothing of his real thoughts, for because of sympathy, a secret sense of injustice toward her on his part, a vigorous, morbid impression of the injustice of life as a whole, a desire to do things in a kindly or at least secret and not brutal way, he was led to pretend at all times that he really cared for her, to pose as being comfortable and happy, to lay all his moods to his inability to work. Angela, who could not read him clearly, saw nothing of this. He was too subtle for her understanding at times. She was living in a fool's paradise, playing over a sleeping volcano. He grew no better, and by fall began to get the notion that he could do better by living in Chicago. His health would come back to him there, perhaps. He was terribly tired of Blackwood. The long tree-shaded lawn was nothing to him now. The little lake, the stream, the fields that he had rejoiced in at first were, to a great extent, a commonplace. Old Jotham was a perpetual source of delight to him, with his kindly, stable, enduring attitude toward things and his interesting comment on life. And Marietta entertained him with her wit, her good nature, her intuitive understanding. But he could not be happy just talking to everyday, normal, stable people, interesting and worthwhile as they might be. The doing of simple things, living a simple life, was just now becoming irritating. He must go to London, Paris, do things. He couldn't loaf this way. It mattered little that he could not work. He must try. This isolation was terrible. There followed 6 months spent in Chicago, in which he painted not one picture that was satisfactory to him, that was not messed into nothingness by changes and changes and changes. There were then 3 months in the mountains of Tennessee, because someone told him of a wonderful, curative spring in a delightful valley, where the spring came as a dream of color, and the expense of living was next to nothing. There were 4 months of summer in southern Kentucky on a ridge where the air was cool, and after that 5 months on the Gulf of Mexico at Biloxi in Mississippi, because some comfortable people in Kentucky and Tennessee told Angela of this delightful winter resort further south. All this time Eugene's money, the $1,500 when he had left Blackwood, several sums of $200, $150, and $250 realized from pictures sold in New York and Paris during the fall and winter following his Paris exhibition, and $200 which had come some months afterwards from a fortuitous sale by M. Charles of one of his old New York views, had been largely dissipated. He still had $500, but with no pictures being sold and none painted, he was in a bad way financially in so far as the future was concerned. He could possibly return to Alexandria with Angela and live cheaply there for another 6 months, but because of the Frieda incident, both he and she objected to it. Angela was afraid of Frieda and was resolved that she would not go there so long as Frieda was in the town. And Eugene was ashamed because of the light a return would throw on his fading art prospects. Blackwood was out of the question to him. They had lived on her parents long enough. If he did not get better, he must soon give up this art idea entirely, for he could not live on trying to paint. He began to think that he was possessed, obsessed of a devil, and that some people were pursued by evil spirits, fated by stars, doomed from their birth to failure or accident. How did the astrologer in New York know that he was to have 4 years of bad luck? He had seen 3 of them already. Why did a man who read his palm in Chicago once say that his hand showed 2 periods of disaster, just as the New York astrologer had, and that he was likely to alter the course of his life radically in the middle portion of it? Were there any fixed laws of being? Did any of the so-called naturalistic school of philosophers and scientists whom he had read know anything at all? They were always talking about the fixed laws of the universe, the unalterable laws of chemistry and physics. Why didn't chemistry or physics throw some light on his peculiar physical condition, on the truthful prediction of the astrologer, on the signs and portents which he had come to observe for himself as foretelling trouble or good fortune for himself? If his left eye twitched, he had observed of late, he was going to have a quarrel with someone, invariably Angela. If he found a penny or any money, he was going to get money, for every notification of the sale of a picture with the accompanying check had been preceded by the discovery of a coin somewhere. Once a penny in State Street, Chicago, on a rainy day. M. Charles wrote that a picture had been sold in Paris for $200. Once a 3-cent piece of the old American issue in the dust of a road in Tennessee. M. Charles wrote that one of his old American views had brought $150. Once a penny in the sands by the Gulf in Biloxi. Another notification of a sale. So it went. He found that when doors squeaked, people were apt to get sick in the houses where they were, and a black dog howling in front of a house was a sure sign of death. He had seen this with his own eyes. This sign, which his mother had once told him of, as having been verified in her experience, in connection with a case of a man who was sick in Biloxi. He was sick, and a dog came running along the street and stopped in front of this place, a black dog, and the man died. Eugene saw this with his own eyes. That is, the dog and the sick man's death notice. The dog howled at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the next morning the man was dead. He saw the crape on the door. Angela mocked at his superstition, but he was convinced. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. End of section 44. Section 45 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 16. Eugene was reaching the point where he had no more money and was compelled to think by what process he would continue to make a living in the future. Worry and a hypochondriacal despair had reduced his body to a comparatively gaunt condition. His eyes had a nervous, apprehensive look. He would walk about speculating upon the mysteries of nature, wondering how he was to get out of this, What was to become of him? How soon, if ever, another picture would be sold? When? And Angela, having fancied that his illness was a mere temporary indisposition, had come to feel that he might be seriously affected for some time. He was not sick physically. He could walk and eat and talk vigorously enough, but he could not work, and he was worrying, worrying, worrying. Angela was quite as well aware as Eugene that their finances were in a bad way or threatening to become so, though he said nothing at all about them. He was ashamed to confess at this day, after their very conspicuous beginning in New York, that he was in fear of not doing well. How silly! He with all his ability. Surely he would get over this, and soon. Angela's economical upbringing and naturally saving instinct stood her in good stead now, for she could market with the greatest care, purchase to the best advantage, make every scrap and penny count. She knew how to make her own clothes, as Eugene had found out when he first visited Blackwood, and was good at designing hats. Although she had thought in New York, when Eugene first began to make money, that now she would indulge in tailor-made garments and the art of an excellent dressmaker, she had never done so. With true frugality, she had decided to wait a little while, and then Eugene's health having failed, she had not the chance any more. Fearing the possible long duration of this storm, she had begun to mend and clean and press and make over whatever seemed to require it. Even when Eugene suggested that she get something new, she would not do it. Her consideration for their future, the difficulty he might have in making a living, deterred her. Eugene noted this, though he said nothing. He was not unaware of the fear that she felt, the patience she exhibited, the sacrifice she made of her own whims and desires to his, and he was not entirely unappreciative. It was becoming very apparent to him that she had no life outside his own, no interests. She was his shadow, his alter ego, his servant, his anything he wanted her to be. Little Pigtail was one of his jesting pet names for her, because in the West as a boy they had always called anyone who ran errands for others pigtailers. In playing one old cat, if one wanted another to chase the struck balls, he would say, "You pigtail for me, Willie, will you?" And Angela was his little pigtail. There were no further grounds for jealousy during the time, almost 2 years, in which they were wandering around together, for the reason that she was always with him, almost his sole companion, and that they did not stay long enough in any one place, under sufficiently free social conditions, to permit him to form those intimacies which might have resulted disastrously. Some girls did take his eye. The exceptional in youth and physical perfection were always doing that, but he had no chance or very little of meeting them socially. They were not living with people they knew, were not introduced into local social worlds which they visited. Eugene could only look at these maidens whom he chanced to spy from time to time and wish that he might know them better. It was hard to be tied down to a conventional acceptance of matrimony, to pretend that he was interested in beauty only in a sociological way. He had to do it before Angela, though, and all conventional people for that matter, for she objected strenuously to the least interest he might manifest in any particular woman. All his remarks had to be general and guarded in their character. At the least show of feeling or admiration, Angela would begin to criticize his choice and show him where his admiration was ill-founded. If he were especially interested, she would attempt to tear his latest idea to pieces. She had no mercy, and he could see plainly enough on what her criticism was based. It made him smile, but he said nothing. He even admired her for her heroic efforts to hold her own, though every victory she seemed to win served only to strengthen the bars of his own cage. It was during this time that he could not help learning and appreciating just how eager, patient, and genuine was her regard for his material welfare. To her he was obviously the greatest man in the world, a great painter, a great thinker, a great lover, a great personality every way. It didn't make so much difference to her at this time
that he wasn't making any money. He would sometime, surely. And wasn't she getting it all in fame anyhow, now? Why, to be Miss Eugene Witla, after what she had seen of him in New York and Paris, what more could she want? Wasn't it all right for her to rake and scrape now, to make her own clothes and hats, save, mend, press, and patch? He would come out of all this silly feeling about other women once he became a little older, and then he would be all right. Anyhow, he appeared to love her now, and that was something. Because he was lonely, fearsome, uncertain of himself, uncertain of the future, he welcomed these unsparing attentions on her part, and this deceived her. Who else would give them to him? He thought, who else would be so faithful in times like these? He almost came to believe that he could love her again, be faithful to her, if he could keep out of the range of these other enticing personalities. If he could only stamp out this eager desire for other women, their praise and their beauty. But this was more because he was sick and lonely than anything else. If he had been restored to health then and there, if prosperity had descended upon him, as he so eagerly dreamed, it would have been the same as ever. He was as subtle as nature itself, as changeable as a chameleon. But two things were significant and real, two things to which he was true and unvarying as the needle to the pole. His love of the beauty of life, which was coupled with his desire to express it in color, and his love of beauty in the form of the face of a woman, or rather that of a girl of 18. That blossoming of life in womanhood at 18. There was no other thing under the sun like it to him. It was like the budding of the trees in the spring, the blossoming of flowers in the early morning, the odor of roses and dew, the color of bright waters and clear jewels. He could not be faithless to that. He could not get away from it. It haunted him like a joyous vision, and the fact that the charms of Stella and Ruby and Angela and Christina and Frieda, in whom it had been partially or wholly shadowed forth at one time or another, had come and gone, made little difference. It remained clear and demanding. He could not escape it. The thought, he could not deny it. He was haunted by this day after day, hour after hour, and when he said to himself that he was a fool, and that it would lure him as a will-o'-the-wisp to his destruction, and that he could find no profit in it ultimately, still it would not down. The beauty of youth, the beauty of 18. To him life without it was a joke, a shabby scramble, a workhorse job, with only silly material details like furniture and houses and steel cars and stores, all involved in a struggle for what? To make a habitation for more shabby humanity? Never. To make a habitation for beauty? Certainly. What beauty? The beauty of old age? How silly. The beauty of middle age? Nonsense. The beauty of maturity? No. The beauty of youth? Yes. The beauty of 18, no more and no less. That was the standard, and the history of the world proved it. Art, literature, romance, history, poetry, if they did not turn on this, and the lure of this, and the wars and sins because of this, what did they turn on? He was for beauty. The history of the world justified him. Who could deny it? End of section 45. Section 46 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 17. From Biloxi, because of the approach of summer, when it would be unbearably warm there, and because his funds were so low that it was necessary to make a decisive move of some kind, whether it led to complete disaster or not, he decided to return to New York. In storage with Kellners, M. Charles had kindly volunteered to take care of them for him, were a number of the pictures left over from the original show, and nearly all the paintings of the Paris exhibition. The latter had not sold well. Eugene's idea was that he could slip into New York quietly, take a room in some side street, or in Jersey City or Brooklyn, where he would not be seen, have the pictures in the possession of M. Charles returned to him, and see if he could not get some of the minor art dealers or speculators of whom he had heard to come and look at them and buy them outright. Failing that, he might take them himself one by one to different dealers here and there, and dispose of them. He remembered now that Eberhard Zang had, through Norma Whitmore, asked him to come and see him. He fancied that, as Kellner's had been so interested, and the newspaper critics had spoken of him so kindly, that smaller dealers would be eager to take up with him. Surely they would buy this material. It was exceptional. Very. Why not? Eugene forgot or did not know the metaphysical side of prosperity and failure. He did not realize that, as a man thinketh, so is he. And so also is the estimate of the whole world at the time he is thinking of himself thus. Not as he is, but as he thinks he is. The sense of it is abroad. By what process we know not, but so it is. Eugene's mental state, so depressed, so helpless, so fearsome, a rudderless boat in the dark, transmitted itself as an impression, a wireless message to all those who knew him or knew of him. His breakdown, which had first astonished M. Charles, depressed, then weakened the latter's interest in him. Like all other capable, successful men in the commercial world, M. Charles was for strong men, men in the heyday of their success, the zenith of their ability. The least variation from this standard of force and interest was noticeable to him. If a man was going to fail, going to get sick and lose his interest in life, or have his viewpoint affected, it might be very sad, but there was just one thing to do under such circumstances: get away from him. Failures of any kind were dangerous things to countenance. One must not have anything to do with them. They were very unprofitable. Such people as Temple Boyle and Vincent Beers, who had been his instructors in the past, and who had heard of him in Chicago at the time of his success, Luke Severus, William McConnell, Orrin Benedict, Hudson Dula, and others wondered what had become of him. Why did he not paint any more? He was never seen in the New York haunts of art. It was rumored at the time of the Paris exhibition that he was going to London to do a similar group of views. But the London exhibition never came off. He had told Smite and McHugh the spring he left he might do Chicago next, but that came to nothing. There was no evidence of it. There were rumors that he was very rich, that his art had failed him, that he had lost his mind even. So the art world that knew him and was so interested in him no longer cared very much. It was too bad, but, so thought the rival artists, there was one less difficult star to contend with. As for his friends, they were very sorry, but such was life. He might recover. If not, well. As time went on, one year, another year, the strangeness of a suddenly brilliant burst and disappearance became to the talented in this field a form of classic memory. He was a man of such promise. Why did he not go on painting? There was an occasional mention in conversation or in print, but Eugene, to all intents and purposes, was dead. When he came to New York, it was after his capital had been reduced to $300, and he had given Angela $125 of this to take her back to Blackwood and keep her there until he could make such arrangements as would permit her to join him. After a long discussion, they had finally agreed that this would be best, for, seeing that he could neither paint nor illustrate, there was no certainty as to what he would do. To come here on so little money with her was not advisable. She had her home, where she was welcome to stay for a while, anyhow. Meanwhile, he figured he could weather any storm alone. The appearance of the metropolis, after somewhat over 2 years of absence, during which he had wandered everywhere, was most impressive to Eugene. It was a relief after the mountains of Kentucky and Tennessee, and the loneliness of the Biloxi coast, to get back to this swarming city where millions were hurrying to and fro, and where one's misery, as well as one's prosperity, was apparently swallowed up in an inconceivable mass of life. The subway was being built. The automobile, which only a few years before was having a vague, uncertain beginning, was now attaining a tremendous vogue. Magnificent cars of new design were everywhere. From the ferry house in Jersey City he could see notable changes in the skyline, and a single walk across 23rd Street and up 7th Avenue showed him a changing world. Great hotels, great apartment houses, a tremendous crush of vainglorious life which was molding the city to its desires. It depressed him greatly, for he had always hoped to be an integral part of this magnificence and display. Now he was not, might never be again. It was still raw cold, for the spring was just beginning to break, and Eugene was compelled to buy a light overcoat. His own imperishable greatcoat having been left behind, and he had no other fit to wear. Appearances, he thought, demanded this. He had spent $40 of his closely guarded $175 coming from Biloxi to New York, and now an additional $15 was required for this coat, leaving him $125 with which to begin his career anew. He was greatly worried as to the outcome, but curiously also he had an abiding subconscious feeling that it could not be utterly destructive to him. He rented a cheap room in a semi-respectable neighborhood in West 24th Street, near 11th Avenue, solely because he wanted to keep out of the run of intellectual life and hide until he could get on his feet. It was an old and shabby residence in an old and shabby red brick neighborhood, such as he had drawn in one of his views, but it was not utterly bad. The people were poor, but fairly intellectual. He chose this particular neighborhood with all its poverty because it was near the North River, where the great river traffic could be seen, and where, because of some open lots in which were stored wagons, his one single west window gave him a view of all this life. About the corner in 23rd Street, in another somewhat decayed residence, was a moderate-priced restaurant and boarding house. Here he could get a meal for 25 cents. He cared nothing for the life that was about him. It was cheap, poor, and from a money point of view, dingy. But he would not be here forever, he hoped. These people did not know him. Besides, the number 552 West 24th Street did not sound so bad. It might be one of the old neighborhoods with which New York was dotted, and which artists were inclined to find and occupy. After he had secured this room from a semi-respectable Irish landlady, a dock weigher's wife, he decided to call upon M. Charles. He knew that he looked quite respectable as yet, despite his poverty and decline. His clothes were good, his overcoat new, his manner brisk and determined. But what he could not see was that his face, in its thin sallowness, and his eyes with their semi-feverish luster, bespoke a mind that was harassed by trouble of some kind. He stood outside the office of Kellner & Son in Fifth Avenue, half a block from the door, wondering whether he should go in, and just what he should say. He had written to M. Charles from time to time that his health was bad and that he couldn't work. Always he had hoped to be better soon. He had always hoped that a reply would come that another of his pictures had been sold. 1 year had gone, and then 2, and now a third was under way, and still he was not any better. M. Charles would look at him searchingly. He would have to bear his gaze unflinchingly. In his present nervous state this was difficult, and yet he was not without a kind of defiance even now. He would force himself back into favor with life sometime. He finally mustered up his courage and entered, and M. Charles greeted him warmly. "This certainly is good to see you again. I had almost given up hope that you would ever come back to New York. How is your health now? And how is Mrs. Witla? It doesn't seem as though it has been 3 years. You're looking excellent. And how is painting going now? Getting to the point where you can do something again?" Eugene felt for the moment as though M. Charles believed him to be in excellent condition, whereas that shrewd observer of men was wondering what could have worked so great a change. Eugene appeared to be 8 years older. There were marked wrinkles between his eyes, and an air of lassitude and weariness. He thought to himself, "Why, this man may possibly be done for artistically. Something has gone from him which I noted the first time I met him, that fire and intense enthusiasm which radiated force after the fashion of an arc light. Now he seems to be seeking to draw something in, to save himself from drowning, as it were. He is making a voiceless appeal for consideration. What a pity! The worst of it all was that in his estimation nothing could be done in such a case. You couldn't do anything for an artist who could do nothing for himself. His art was gone. The sanest thing for him to do would be to quit trying, go at some other form of labor, and forget all about it. It might be that he would recover, but it was a question. Nervous breakdowns were not infrequently permanent. Eugene noticed something of this in his manner. He couldn't tell exactly what it was, but M. Charles seemed more than ordinarily preoccupied, careful and distant. He wasn't exactly chilly in his manner, but reserved, as though he were afraid he might be asked to do something which he could not very well do. "I noticed that the Paris scenes did not do very well either here or in Paris," observed Eugene, with an air of nonchalance, as though it were a matter of small importance, at the same time hoping that he would have some favorable word. "I had the idea that they would take better than they did. Still, I don't suppose I ought to expect everything to sell. The New York ones did all right." "They did very well indeed, much better than I expected. I didn't think as many would be sold as were. They were very new and considerably outside the lines of current interests. The Paris pictures, on the other hand, were foreign to Americans in the wrong sense. By that I mean they weren't to be included in that genre art which comes from abroad, but is not based on any locality and is universal in its appeal, thematically speaking. Your Paris pictures were, of course, pictures in the best sense to those who see art as color and composition and idea. But to the ordinary lay mind they were, I take it, merely Paris scenes. You get what I mean. In that sense they were foreign, and Paris has been done illustratively anyhow. You might have done better with London or Chicago. Still, you have every reason to congratulate yourself. Your work has made a distinct impression both here and in France. When you feel able to return to it, I have no doubt you will find that time has done you no harm." He tried to be polite and entertaining, but he was glad when Eugene went away again. The latter turned out into the street disconsolate. He could see how things were. He was down and out for the present, and would have to wait. End of section 46.
Section 47 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 18. The next thing was to see what could be done with the other art dealers and the paintings that were left. There were quite a number of them. If he could get any reasonable price at all, he ought to be able to live quite a while, long enough anyhow to get on his feet again. When they came to his quiet room and were unpacked by him in a rather shamefaced and disturbed manner and distributed about, they seemed wonderful things. Why, if the critics had raved over them, and M. Charles had thought they were so fine, could they not be sold? Art dealers would surely buy them. Still, now that he was on the ground again, and could see the distinctive art shops from the sidewalks, his courage failed him. They were not running after pictures. Exceptional as he might be, there were artists in plenty, good ones. He could not run to other well-known art dealers very well, for his work had become identified with the house of Kellner and Son. Some of the small dealers might buy them, but they would not buy them all, probably one or two at the most, and that at a sacrifice. What a pass to come to! He, Eugene Witla, who 3 years before had been in the heyday of his approaching prosperity, wondering as he stood in the room of a gloomy side street house how he was going to raise money to live through the summer, and how he was going to sell the paintings which had seemed the substance of his fortune but 2 years before. He decided that he would ask several of the middle-class dealers whether they would not come and look at what he had to show. To a number of the smaller dealers in 4th, 6th, 8th Avenues and elsewhere he would offer to sell several outright when necessity pinched. Still, he had to raise money soon. Angela
could not be left at Blackwood indefinitely. He went to Jacob Bergman, Henry LaRue, Pottle Faries, and asked if they would be interested to see what he had. Henry Bergman, who was his own manager, recalled his name at once. He had seen the exhibition but was not eager. He asked curiously how the pictures of the first and second exhibitions had sold, how many there were of them, what prices they brought. Eugene told him. "You might bring one or two here and leave them on sale. You know how that is. Someone might take a fancy to them. You never can tell." He explained that his commission was 25%, and that he would report when a sale was made. He was not interested to come and see them. Eugene could select any two pictures he pleased. It was the same with Henry LaRue and Pottle Faries, though the latter had never heard of him. They asked him to show them one of his pictures. Eugene's pride was touched the least bit by this lack of knowledge on their part. Though seeing how things were going with him, he felt as though he might expect as much and more. Other art dealers he did not care to trust with his paintings on sale, and he was now ashamed to start carrying them about to the magazines, where at least 125 to 150 per picture might be expected for them, if they were sold at all. He did not want the magazine art world to think that he had come to this. His best friend was Hudson Dula, and he might no longer be art director of Truth. As a matter of fact, Dula was no longer there. Then there were Jan Jansen and several others, but they were no doubt thinking of him now as a successful painter. It seems as though his natural pride were building insurmountable barriers for him. How was he to live if he could not do this and could not paint? He decided on trying the small art dealers with a single picture, offering to sell it outright. They might not recognize him, and so might buy it direct. He could accept in such cases, without much shock to his pride, anything which they might offer, if it were not too little. He tried this one bright morning in May, and though it was not without result, it spoiled a beautiful day for him. He took one picture, a New York scene, and carried it to a third-rate art dealer whose place he had seen in Upper Sixth Avenue, and without saying anything about himself, asked if he would like to buy it. The proprietor, a small, dark individual of Semitic extraction, looked at him curiously and at his picture. He could tell from a single look that Eugene was in trouble, that he needed money, and that he was anxious to sell his picture. He thought, of course, that he would take anything for it, and he was not sure that he wanted the picture at that. It was not very popular in theme, a view of a famous Sixth Avenue restaurant showing behind the track of the L road, with a driving rain pouring in between the interstices of light. Years after this picture was picked up by a collector from Kansas City at an old furniture sale and hung among his gems. But this morning its merits were not very much in evidence. "I see that you occasionally exhibit a painting in your window for sale. Do you buy originals?" "Now and again," said the man indifferently. "Not often. What have you?" "I have an oil here that I painted not so long ago. I occasionally do these things. I thought maybe you would like to buy it." The proprietor stood by indifferently while Eugene untied the string, took off the paper, and stood the picture up for inspection. It was striking enough in its way, but it did not appeal to him as being popular. "I don't think it's anything that I could sell here," he remarked, shrugging his shoulders. "It's good, but we don't have much call for pictures of any kind. If it were a straight landscape, or a marine, or a figure of some kind, figures sell the best. But this, I doubt if I could get rid of it. You might leave it on sale if you want to. Somebody might like it. I don't think I'd care to buy it." "I don't care to leave it on sale," replied Eugene irritably. Leave one of his pictures in a cheap side street art store, and that on sale? He would not. He wanted to say something cutting in reply, but he curbed his welling wrath to ask, "How much do you think it would be worth if you did want it?" "Oh," replied the proprietor, pursing his lips reflectively, "not more than $10. We can't ask much for anything we have on view here. The Fifth Avenue stores take all the good trade." Eugene winced. $10? Why, what a ridiculous sum!
What was the use of coming to a place like this anyhow? He could do better dealings with the art directors or the better stores. But where were they? Whom could he deal with? Where were there any stores much better than this outside the large ones which he had already canvassed? He had better keep his pictures and go to work now at something else. He only had 35 of them all told, and at this rate he would have just $350 when they were all gone. What good would that do him? His mood and this preliminary experience convinced him that they could not be sold for any much greater sum. $15 or less would probably be offered, and he would be no better off at the end. His pictures would be gone, and he would have nothing. He ought to get something to do and save his pictures. But what? To a man in Eugene's position, he was now 31 years of age, with no training outside what he had acquired in developing his artistic judgment and ability, this proposition of finding something else which he could do was very difficult. His mental sickness was, of course, the first great bar. It made him appear nervous and discouraged, and so more or less objectionable to anyone who was looking for vigorous, healthy manhood in the shape of an employee. In the next place, his look and manner had become decidedly that of the artist, refined, retiring, subtle. He also had an air at times of finicky standoffishness, particularly in the presence of those who appeared to him commonplace, or who by their look or manner appeared to be attempting to set themselves over him. In the last place, he could think of nothing that he really wanted to do. The idea that his art ability would come back to him, or that it ought to serve him in this crisis, haunted him all the time. Once he had thought he might like to be an art director. He was convinced that he would be a good one. And another time he had thought that he would like to write. But that was long ago. He had never written anything since the Chicago newspaper specials, and several efforts for concentrating his mind for this quickly proved to him that writing was not for him now. It was hard for him to formulate an intelligent, consecutive ideaed letter to Angela. He harked back to his old Chicago days, and remembering that he had been a collector and a driver of a laundry wagon, he decided that he might do something of that sort. Getting a position as a streetcar conductor or a dry goods clerk appealed to him as possibilities. The necessity of doing something within regular hours and in a routine way appealed to him as having curative properties. How should he get such a thing? If it had not been for the bedeviled state of his mind, this would not have been such a difficult matter, for he was physically active enough to hold any ordinary position. He might have appealed frankly and simply to M. Charles or Isaac Wertheim, and through influence obtained something which would have tided him over. But he was too sensitive to begin with, and his present weakness made him all the more fearful and retiring. He had but one desire when he thought of doing anything outside his creative gift, and that was to slink away from the gaze of men. How could he, with his appearance, his reputation, his tastes and refinement, hobnob with conductors, dry goods clerks, railroad hands, or drivers? It wasn't possible. He hadn't the strength. Besides, all that was a thing of the past, or he thought it was. He had put it behind him in his art student days. Now, to have to get out and look for a job, how could he? He walked the streets for days and days, coming back to his room to see if by any chance he could paint yet, write long, rambling, emotional letters to Angela. It was pitiful. In fits of gloom he would take out an occasional picture and sell it, parting with it for $10 or $15 after he had carried it sometimes for miles. His one refuge was in walking, for somehow he could not walk and feel very, very bad. The beauty of nature, the activity of people, entertained and diverted his mind. He would come back to his room some evenings feeling as though a great change had come over him, as though he were going to do better now. But this did not last long. A little while, and he would be back in his old mood again. He spent 3 months this way, drifting, before he realized that he must do something, that fall and winter would be coming on again in a little while, and he would have nothing at all.
In his desperation, he first attempted to get an art directorship. But 2 or 3 interviews with publishers of magazines proved to him pretty quickly that positions of this character were not handed out to the inexperienced. It required an apprenticeship, just as anything else did, and those who had positions in this field elsewhere had the first call. His name or appearance did not appear to strike any of these gentlemen as either familiar or important in any way. They had heard of him as an illustrator and a painter, but his present appearance indicated that this was a refuge in ill health which he was seeking, not a vigorous constructive position, and so they would have none of him. He next tried at 3 of the principal publishing houses, but they did not require anyone in that capacity. Truth to tell, he knew very little of the details and responsibilities of the position, though he thought he did. After that, there was nothing save dry goods stores, streetcar registration offices, the employment offices of the great railroads and factories. He looked at sugar refineries, tobacco factories, express offices, railroad freight offices, wondering whether in any of these it would be possible for him to obtain a position which would give him a salary of $10 a week. If he could get that, and any of his pictures now on show with Jacob Bergman, Henry LaRue, and Pottle Frères should be sold, he could get along. He might even live on this with Angela if he could sell an occasional picture for $10 or $15. But he was paying $7 a week for nothing save food and room, and scarcely managing to cling to the $100 which had remained of his original traveling fund after he had paid all his opening expenses here in New York. He was afraid to part with all his pictures in this way for fear that he would be sorry for it after a while. Work is hard to get under the most favorable conditions of health and youth and ambition, and the difficulties of obtaining it under unfavorable ones need not be insisted on. Imagine, if you can, the crowds of men, 40, 50, 100 strong, that wait at the door of every dry goods employment office, every streetcar registration bureau, on the special days set aside for considering applications, at every factory shop or office where an advertisement calling for a certain type of man or woman was inserted in the newspapers. On a few occasions that Eugene tried or attempted to try, he found himself preceded by a peculiar group of individuals who eyed him curiously as he approached, wondering, as he thought, whether a man of his type could be coming to apply for a job. They seemed radically different from himself to his mind. Men with little education and grim consciousness of the difficulties of life. Young men, vapid-looking men, shabby, stale, discouraged types, men who, like himself, looked as though they had seen something very much better, and men who looked as though they had seen things a great deal worse. The evidence which frightened him was the presence of a group of bright, healthy, eager-looking boys of 19, 20, 21, and 22, who, like himself, when he first went to Chicago years before, were everywhere he went. When he drew near, he invariably found it impossible to indicate in any way that he was looking for anything. He couldn't. His courage failed him. He felt that he looked too superior. Self-consciousness and shame overcame him. He learned now that men rose as early as 4 o'clock in the morning to buy a newspaper and ran quickly to the address mentioned in order to get the place at the head of the line, thus getting the first consideration as an applicant. He learned that some other men, such as waiters, cooks, hotel employees, and so on, frequently stayed up all night in order to buy a paper at 2 in the morning, winter or summer, rain or snow, heat or cold, and hurry to the promising addresses they might find. He learned the crowds of applicants were apt to become surly or sarcastic or contentious as their individual chances were jeopardized by ever-increasing numbers. And all this now was going on all the time, in winter or summer, heat or cold, rain or snow. Pretending interest as a spectator, he would sometimes stand and watch, hearing the ribald jests, the slurs cast upon life, fortune, individuals in particular, and in general by those who were wearily or hopelessly waiting. It was a horrible picture to him in his present condition. It was like the grinding of the millstones, upper and nether. These were the chaff. He was part of the chaff at present, or in danger of becoming so. Life was winnowing him out. He might go down, down, and there might never be an opportunity for him to rise any more. Few, if any of us, understand thoroughly the nature of the unconscious stratification which takes place in life, the layers and types and classes into which it assorts itself, and the barriers which these offer to free migration of individuals from one class to another. We take on so naturally the material habiliments of our temperaments, necessities, and opportunities. Priests, doctors, lawyers, merchants appear to be born with their particular mental attitude, and likewise the clerk, the ditch digger, the janitor. They have their codes, their guilds, and their class feelings. And while they may be spiritually closely related, they are physically far apart. Eugene, after hunting for a place for a month, knew a great deal more about this stratification than he had ever dreamed of knowing. He found that he was naturally barred by temperament from some things, from others by strength and weight, or rather the lack of them, from others by inexperience, from others by age, and so on. And those who were different from him in any or all of these respects were inclined to look at him askance. "You are not as we are," their eyes seemed to say. "Why do you come here?" One day he approached a gang of men who were waiting outside a car barn and sought to find out where the registration office was. He did not lay off his natural manner of superiority, could not, but asked a man near him if he knew. It had taken all his courage to do this. "He wouldn't be looking for a place as a conductor now, would he?" he heard someone say within his hearing. For some reason this remark took all his courage away. He went up the wooden stairs to the little office where the application blanks were handed out, but did not even have the courage to apply for one. He pretended to be looking for someone and went out again. Later, before a dry goods superintendent's office, he heard a youth remark, "Look what wants to be a clerk." It froze him. It is a question how long this aimless, nervous wandering would have continued if it had not been for the accidental recollection of an experience which a fellow artist once related to him of a writer who had found himself nervously depressed and who, by application to the president of a railroad, had secured, as a courtesy to the profession which he represented so ably, a position as an apprentice in a surveying corps, being given transportation to a distant section of the country and employed at a laborer's wages until he was well. Eugene now thought of this as quite an idea for himself. Why it had not occurred to him before he did not know. He could apply as an artist. His appearance would bear him out, and being able to speak from the vantage point of personal ability temporarily embarrassed by ill health, his chances of getting something would be so much better. It would not be the same as the position which he had secured for himself without fear or favor, but it would be a position different from farming with Angela's father because it would command a salary. End of section 47. Section 48 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 19. The idea of appealing to the president of one of the great railroads that entered New York was not so difficult to execute. Eugene dressed himself very carefully the next morning, and going to the office of the company in 42nd Street, consulted the list of officers posted in one of the halls, and finding the president to be on the third floor, ascended. He discovered, after compelling himself by sheer willpower to enter, that this so-called office was a mere anteroom to a force of assistants serving the president, and that no one could see him except by appointment. "You might see his secretary if he isn't busy," suggested the clerk, who handled his card gingerly. Eugene was for the moment undetermined what to do, but decided that maybe the secretary could help him. He asked that his card might be taken to him, and that no explanation be demanded of him except by the secretary in person. The latter came out after a while, an undersecretary of perhaps 28 years of age, short and stout. He was bland and apparently good-natured. "What is it I can do for you?" he asked. Eugene had been formulating his request in his mind, some method of putting it briefly and simply. "I came up to see Mr. Wilson," he said, "to see if he would not send me out as a day laborer of some kind in connection with some department of the road. I am an artist by profession, and I am suffering from neurasthenia. All the doctors I have consulted have recommended that I get a simple manual position of some kind and work at it until I am well. I know of an instance in which Mr. Wilson assisted in this way Mr. Savin, the author, and I thought he might be willing to interest himself in my case." At the sound of Henry Savin's name, the undersecretary pricked up his ears. He had, fortunately, read one of his books, and this, together with Eugene's knowledge of the case, his personal appearance, a certain ring of sincerity in what he was saying, caused him to be momentarily interested. "There is no position in connection with any clerical work which the president could give you, I am sure," he replied. "All of these things are subject to a system of promotion. It might be that he could place you with one of the construction gangs in one of the departments under a foreman. I don't know. It's very hard work, though. He might consider your case." He smiled commiseratingly. "I question whether you're strong enough to do anything of that sort. It takes a pretty good man to wield a pick or a shovel." "I don't think I'd better worry about that now," replied Eugene in return, smiling wearily. "I'll take the work and see if it won't help me. I think I need it badly enough." He was afraid the undersecretary would repent of his suggestion and refuse him entirely. "Can you wait a little while?" asked the latter curiously. He had the idea that Eugene was someone of importance, for he had suggested as a parting argument that he could give a number of exceptional references. "Certainly," said Eugene, and the secretary went his way, coming back in half an hour to hand him an enveloped letter. "We have the idea," he said quite frankly, waiving any suggestion of the president's influence in the matter, and speaking for himself and the secretary in chief, with whom he had agreed that Eugene ought to be assisted, "that you had best apply to the engineering department. Mr. Hobson, the chief engineer, can arrange for you. This letter, I think, will get you what you want." Eugene's heart bounded. He looked at the subscription and saw it addressed to Mr. Woodruff Hobson, chief engineer, and putting it in his pocket without stopping to read it, but thanking the undersecretary profusely, went out. In the hall at a safe distance he stopped and opened it, finding that it spoke of him familiarly as Mr. Eugene Witla, an artist, temporarily incapacitated by neurasthenia, and went on to say that he was desirous of being appointed to some manual toil in some construction corps. "The president's office recommends this request to your favor." When he read this, he knew it meant a position. It roused curious feelings as to the nature and value of stratification. As a laborer, he was nothing. As an artist, he could get a position as a laborer. After all, his ability as an artist was worth something. It obtained him this refuge. He hugged it joyously, and a few moments later handed it to an undersecretary in the chief engineer's office. Without being seen by anyone in authority, he was in return given a letter to Mr. William Haverford, engineer of maintenance of way, a pale, anemic gentleman of perhaps 40 years of age, who, as Eugene learned from him when he was eventually ushered into his presence a half hour later, was a captain of 13,000 men. The latter read the letter from the engineer's office curiously. He was struck by Eugene's odd mission and his appearance as a man. Artists were queer. This was like one. Eugene reminded him of himself a little in his appearance. "An artist," he said interestedly. "So you went to work as a day laborer." He fixed Eugene with clear, coal-black eyes looking out of a long, pear-shaped face. Eugene noticed that his hands were long and thin and white, and that his high, pale forehead was crowned by a mop of black hair. "Neurasthenia. I've heard a great deal about that of late, but have never been troubled that way myself. I find that I derive considerable benefit when I am nervous from the use of a rubber exerciser. You have seen them, perhaps?" "Yes," Eugene replied, "I have. My case is much too grave for that, I think. I have traveled a great deal, but it doesn't seem to do me any good. I want to work at something manual, I fancy, something at which I have to work. Exercise in a room would not help me. I think I need a complete change of environment. I will be much obliged to you if you will place me in some capacity." "Well, this will very likely be it," suggested Mr. Haverford blandly. "Working as a day laborer will certainly not strike you as play. To tell you the truth, I don't think you can stand it." He reached for a glass-framed map showing the various divisions of the railroad stretching from New England to Chicago and St. Louis, and observed quietly, "I could send you to a great many places. Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Michigan, Canada." His finger roved idly about. "I have 13,000 men in my department, and they are scattered far and wide." Eugene marveled. Such a position, such authority. This pale dark man sitting as an engineer at a switchboard, directing so large a machine. "You have a very large force," he said simply. Mr. Haverford smiled wanly. "I think, if you will take my advice, you will not go into a construction corps right away. You can hardly do manual labor. There is a little carpenter shop which we have at Speonk, not very far outside the city, which I think would answer your needs admirably. A little creek joins the Hudson there, and it is out on a point of land, the shop is. It's summer now, and to put you in a boiling sun with a gang of Italians would be a little rough. Take my advice and go here. It will be hard enough. After you are broken in, and you think you want a change, I can easily arrange it for you. The money may not make so much difference to you, but you may as well have it. It will be 15 cents an hour. I will give you a letter to Mr. Littlebrown, our division engineer, and he will see that you are properly provided for." Eugene bowed. Inwardly he smiled at the thought that the money would not be acceptable to him. Anything would be acceptable. Perhaps this would be best. It was near the city. The description of the little carpenter shop out on the neck of land appealed to him. It was, as he found when he looked at the map of the immediate division to which this belonged, almost within the city limits. He could live in New York, the upper portion of it anyhow. Again there was a letter, this time to Mr. Henry C. Littlebrown, a tall, meditative, philosophic man, whom Eugene found 2 days later in the division offices at Yonkers, who in turn wrote a letter to Mr. Joseph Brooks, superintendent of buildings at Mott Haven, whose secretary finally gave Eugene a letter to Mr. Jack Stix, foreman, carpenter at Speonk. This letter, when presented on a bright Friday afternoon, brought him the advice to come Monday at 7 a.m. And so Eugene saw a career as a day laborer stretching very conspicuously before him. The little shop in question was located in the most charming manner possible. If it had been set as a stage scene for his especial artistic benefit, it could not have been better. On a point of land between the river and the main line of the railroad, and a little creek which was east of the railroad, and which the latter crossed on a trestle to get back to the mainland again, it stood, a long, low, 2-storied structure, green as to its roof, red as to its body, full of windows which commanded picturesque views of passing yachts and steamers and little launches and rowboats anchored safely in the waters of the cove which the creek formed. There was a veritable song of labor which arose from this shop, for it was filled with planes, lathes, and wood-turning instruments of various kinds, to say nothing of great groups of carpenters who could make desks, chairs, tables, in short, office furniture of various kinds, and who kept the company's needs of these fittings for its depots and offices well supplied. Each carpenter had a bench before a window on the second floor, and in the center were the few necessary machines they were always using: small jig, crosscut, band, and rip saws, a plane, and 4 or 5 lathes. On the ground floor was the engine room, the blacksmith shop, the giant plane, the great jig and crosscut saws, and the storeroom and supply closets. Out in the yard were piles of lumber with tracks in between, and twice every day a local freight called the Dinky stopped to switch in or take out loaded cars of lumber or finished furniture and supplies. Eugene, as he approached on the day he presented his letter, stopped to admire the neatness of the low board fence which surrounded it all, the beauty of the water, the droning sweetness of the saws. Why, the work here couldn't be very hard, he thought. He saw carpenters looking out of the upper windows, and a couple of men in brown overalls and jumpers unloading a car. They were carrying great 3x6 joists on their shoulders. Would he be asked to do anything like that? He scarcely thought so. Mr. Haverford had distinctly indicated in his letter to Mr. Littlebrown that he was to be built up by degrees. Carrying great joists did not appeal to him as the right way, but he presented his letter. He had previously looked about on the high ground which lay to the back of the river and which commanded this point of land, to see if he could find a place to board and lodge, but had seen nothing. The section was very exclusive, occupied by suburban New Yorkers of wealth, and they were not interested in the proposition which he had formulated in his own mind, namely, his temporary reception somewhere as a paying guest. He had visions of a comfortable home somewhere now, with nice people, for strangely enough, the securing of this very minor position had impressed him as the beginning of the end of his bad luck. He was probably going to get well now, in the course of time. If he could only live with some nice family for the summer. In the fall, if he were improving, and he thought he might be, Angela could come on. It might be that one of the dealers, Pottle Faris, or Jacob Bergman, or Henry LaRue, would have sold a picture. $150 or $200 joined to his salary would go a long way towards making their living moderately comfortable. Besides, Angela's taste and economy, coupled with his own art judgment, could make any little place look respectable and attractive. The problem of finding a room was not so easy. He followed the track south to a settlement which was visible from the shop windows a quarter of a mile away, and finding nothing which suited his taste as to location, returned to Speonk proper and followed the little creek inland half a mile. This adventure delighted him, for it revealed a semicircle of charming cottages ranged upon a hill slope which had for its footstool the little silvery bosomed stream. Between the stream and the hill slope ran a semicircular road, and above that another road. Eugene could see at a glance that here was middle-class prosperity, smooth lawns, bright awnings, flower pots of blue and yellow and green upon the porches, doorsteps, and verandas. An auto standing in front of one house indicated a certain familiarity with the ways of the rich, and a summer roadhouse, situated at the intersection of a road leading out from New York and the little stream where it was crossed by a bridge, indicated that the charms of this village were not unknown to those who came touring and seeking for pleasure. The roadhouse itself was hung with awnings and one dining balcony out over the water. Eugene's desire was fixed on this village at once. He wanted to live here, anywhere in it. He walked about under the cool shade of the trees, looking at first one dooryard and then another, wishing that he might introduce himself by letter and be received. They ought to welcome an artist of his ability and refinement, and would, he thought, if they knew. His working in a furniture factory, or for the railroad as a day laborer for his health, simply added to his picturesque character. In his wanderings he finally came upon a Methodist church quaintly built of red brick and gray stone trimmings, and the sight of its tall stained glass windows and square fortress-like bell tower gave him an idea. Why not appeal to the minister? He could explain to him what he wanted, show him his credentials, for he had with him old letters from editors, publishers, and art houses, and give him a clear understanding as to why he wanted to come here at all. His ill health and distinction ought to appeal to this man, and he would probably direct him to someone who would gladly have him. At 5 in the afternoon he knocked at the door and was received in the pastor's study. A large still room in which a few flies were buzzing in the shaded light. In a few moments the minister himself came in, a tall, gray-headed man, severely simple in his attire and with an easy air of one who is used to public address. He was about to ask what he could do for him when Eugene began with his explanation. "You don't know me at all. I'm a stranger in this section. I am an artist by profession, and I am coming to Speonk on Monday to work in the railroad shop there for my health. I have been suffering from a nervous breakdown and am going to try day labor for a while. I want to find a convenient, pleasant place to live, and I thought you might know of someone here or near here who might be willing to take me in for a little while. I can give excellent references. There doesn't appear to be anything in the immediate neighborhood of the shop." "It's rather isolated there," replied the old minister, studying Eugene carefully. "I've often wondered how all those men like it, traveling so far. None of them live about here." He looked at Eugene solemnly, taking in his various characteristics. He was not badly impressed. He seemed to be a reserved, thoughtful, dignified young man, and decidedly artistic. It struck him as very interesting that he should be trying so radical a thing as day labor for his nerves. "Let me see," he said thoughtfully. He sat down in his chair near his table and put his hand over his eyes. "I don't think of anyone just at the moment. There are plenty of families who have room to take you in if they would, but I question very much whether they would. In fact, I'm sure they wouldn't. Let me see now." He thought again. Eugene studied his big aquiline nose, his shaggy gray eyebrows, his thick, crisp gray hair. Already his mind was sketching him, the desk, the dim walls, the whole atmosphere of the room. "No, no," he said slowly. "I don't think of anyone. There is one family, Mrs. Hilberdell. She lives in the, let me see, first, second, third, 10th house above here. She has one nephew with her at present, a young man of about your age, and I don't think anyone else. I don't know that she would consider taking you in, but she might. Her house is quite large. She did have a daughter with her at one time, but I'm not sure that she's there now. I think not." He talked as though he were reporting his own thoughts to himself audibly. Eugene pricked up his ears at the mention of a daughter. During all the time he had been out of New York, he had not, with the exception of Frieda, had a single opportunity to talk intimately with any girl. Angela had been with him all the time. Here in New York, since he had been back, he had been living under such distressing conditions that he had not thought of either youth or love. He had no business to be thinking of it now, but this summer air, this tree-shaded village, the fact that he had a position, small as it was, on which he could depend and which would no doubt benefit him mentally, and that he was somehow feeling better about himself because he was going to work, made him feel that he might look more interestedly on life again. He was not going to die. He was going to get well. Finding this position proved it. And he might go to the house now and find some charming girl who would like him very much. Angela was away. He was alone. He had again the freedom of his youth. If he were only well and working. He thanked the old minister very politely and went his way, recognizing the house by certain details given him by the minister. A double balconied veranda, some red rockers, 2 yellow jardinières at the doorstep, a grayish-white picket fence and gate. He walked up smartly and rang the bell. A very intelligent woman of perhaps 55 or 60, with bright gray hair and clear, light blue eyes, was coming out with a book in her hand. Eugene stated his case. She listened with keen interest, looking him over the while. His appearance took her fancy, for she was of a strong intellectual and literary turn of mind. "I wouldn't ordinarily consider anything of the kind, but I am alone here with my nephew, and the house could easily accommodate a dozen. I don't want to do anything which will irritate him, but if you will come back in the morning I will let you know. It would not disturb me to have you about. Do you happen to know an artist by the name of Deesa?" "I know him well," replied Eugene. "He's an old friend of mine." "He's a friend of my daughter's, I think. Have you inquired anywhere else here in the village?" "No," said Eugene. "That is just as well," she replied. He took the hint. So there was no daughter here. Well, what matter? The view was beautiful. Of an evening he could sit out here in one of the rocking chairs and look at the water. The evening sun, already low in the west, was burnishing it a bright gold. The outline of the hill on the other side was dignified and peaceful. He could sleep and work as a day laborer and take life easy for a while. He could get well now, and this was the way to do it. Day laborer. How fine, how original, how interesting. He felt somewhat like a knight errant reconnoitering a new and very strange world. End of section 48.
Section 49 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 20. The matter of securing admission to this house was quickly settled. The nephew, a genial, intelligent man of 34, as Eugene discovered later, had no objection. It appeared to Eugene that in some way he contributed to the support of this house, though Mrs. Hibberdell obviously had some money of her own. A charmingly furnished room on the second floor adjoining one of the several baths was assigned him, and he was at once admitted to the freedom of the house. There were books, a piano, but no one to play it, a hammock, a maid-of-all-work, and an atmosphere of content and peace. Mrs. Hibberdell, a widow, presumably of some years of widowhood, was of that experience and judgment in life which gave her intellectual poise. She was not particularly inquisitive about anything in connection with him, and so far as he could see from the surface indications, was refined, silent, conservative. She could jest, and did, in a subtle, understanding way. He told her quite frankly at the time he applied that he was married, that his wife was in the West, and that he expected her to return after his health was somewhat improved. She talked with him about art and books and life in general. Music appeared to be to her a thing apart. She did not care much for it. The nephew, Davis Simpson, was neither literary nor artistic, and apparently cared little for music. He was a buyer for one of the larger department stores, a slight, dapper, rather dandified type of man, with a lean, not thin but tight-muscled face, and a short black mustache, and he appeared to be interested only in the humors of character, trade, baseball, and methods of entertaining himself. The things that pleased Eugene about him were that he was clean, simple, direct, good-natured, and courteous. He apparently had no desire to infringe on anybody's privacy, but was fond of stirring up light discussions and interpolating witty remarks. He liked also to grow flowers and to fish. The care of a border of flowers which glorified a short gravel path in the back yard received his especial attention evenings and mornings. It was a great pleasure for Eugene to come into this atmosphere after the storm which had been assailing him for the past 3 years, and particularly for the past 90 days. He was only asked to pay $8 a week by Mrs. Hibberdell, though he realized that what he was obtaining in home atmosphere here was not ordinarily purchased at any price in the public market. The maid saw to it that a little bouquet of flowers was put on his dressing table daily. He was given fresh towels and linen in ample quantities. The bath was his own. He could sit out on the porch of an evening and look at the water uninterrupted, or he could stay in the library and read. Breakfast and dinner were invariably delightful occasions, for though he rose at 5:45 in order to have his bath, breakfast, and be able to walk to the factory and reach it by 7, Mrs. Hibberdell was invariably up, as it was her habit to rise thus early, and had been for years. She liked it. Eugene, in his weary mood, could scarcely understand this. Davis came to the table some few moments before he would be leaving. He invariably had some cheery remark to offer, for he was never sullen or gloomy. His affairs, whatever they were, did not appear to oppress him. Mrs. Hibberdell would talk to Eugene genially about his work, this small social center of which they were a part and which was called Riverwood, the current movements in politics, religion, science, and so forth. There were references sometimes to her one daughter,
who was married and living in New York. It appeared that she occasionally visited her mother here. Eugene was delighted to think that he had been so fortunate as to find this place. He hoped to make himself so agreeable that there would be no question as to his welcome, and he was not disappointed. Between themselves, Mrs. Hibberdell and Davis discussed him, agreeing that he was entirely charming, a good fellow, and well worth having about. At the factory where Eugene worked, and where the conditions were radically different, he made for himself an atmosphere which was almost entirely agreeable to him, though he quarreled at times with specific details. On the first morning, for instance, he was put to work with two men, heavy clods of souls, he thought at first, familiarly known about the yard as John and Bill. These two, to his artistic eye, appeared machines, more mechanical than humanly self-directive. They were of a medium height, not more than 5 feet 9 inches tall, and weighed about 180 pounds each. One had a round, poorly modeled face, very much the shape of an egg, to which was attached a heavy yellowish mustache. He had a glass eye, complicated in addition by a pair of spectacles which were fastened over his large, protruding red ears with steel hooks. He wore a battered brown hat, now a limp, shapeless mass. His name was Bill Jeffords, and he responded sometimes to the sobriquet of One Eye. The other man was John, alias Jack Duncan, an individual of the same height and build, with but slightly more modeling to his face, and with little, if any, greater intelligence. He looked somewhat the shrewder. Eugene fancied there might be lurking in him somewhere a spark of humor, but he was mistaken. Unquestionably, in Jeffords there was none. Jack Stix, the foreman carpenter, a tall, angular, ambling man with red hair, a red mustache, shifty, uncertain blue eyes, and noticeably big hands and feet, had suggested to Eugene that he work with these men for a little while. His idea was to try him out, as he told one of the associate foremen, who was in charge of a gang of Italians working in the yard for the morning, and he was quite equal to doing it. He thought Eugene had no business here and might possibly be scared off by a little rough work. "He's up here for his health," he told him. "I don't know where he comes from. Mr. Brooks sent him up here with orders to put him on. I want to see how he takes to real work for a while." "Look out you don't hurt him," suggested the other. "He don't look very strong to me." "He's strong enough to carry a few spiles, I guess. If Jimmy can carry him, he can. I don't intend to keep him at it long." Eugene knew nothing of this, but when he was told to "come along, new man," and shown a pile of round, rough ash trunk cuttings 6 inches in diameter and 8 feet long, his courage failed him. He was suffered to carry some of these to the second floor, how many he did not know. "Take them to Thompson up there in the corner," said Jeffords dully. Eugene grasped one uncertainly in the middle with his thin, artistic hands. He did not know that there were ways of handling lumber, just as there were ways of handling a brush. He tried to lift it, but could not. The rough bark scratched his fingers cruelly. "You got to learn something about that before you begin, I guess," said Jack Duncan, who had been standing by eyeing him narrowly. Jeffords had gone about some other work. "I suppose I don't know very much about it," replied Eugene shamefacedly, stopping and waiting for further instructions. "Let me show you a trick," said his associate. "There's tricks in all these here trades. Take it by the end this-a-way and push it along until you can stand it up. Stoop down now and put your shoulder right next the middle. Got a pad under your shirt? You ought to have one. Now put your right arm ahead of you on the spile. Now you're all right." Eugene straightened up, and the rough post balanced itself evenly but crushingly on his shoulder. It appeared to grind his muscles, and his back and legs ached instantly. He started bravely forward, straining to appear at ease, but within 50 feet he was suffering agony. He walked the length of the shop, however, up the stairs and back again to the window where Thompson was, his forehead bursting with perspiration and his ears red with blood. He fairly staggered as he neared the machine and dropped the post heavily. "Look what you're doing," said a voice behind him. It was Thompson, the lathe worker. "Can't you put that down easy?" "No, I can't," replied Eugene angrily, his face tinged with a faint blush from his extreme exertion. He was astonished and enraged to think they should put him doing work like this, especially since Mr. Haverford had told him it would be easy. He suspected at once a plot to drive him away. He would have added, "These are too damn heavy for me," but he restrained himself. He went downstairs wondering how he was to get up the others. He fingered about the pole gingerly, hoping that the time taken this way would ease his pain and give him strength for the next one. Finally he picked up another and staggered painfully to the loft again. The foreman had his eye on him but said nothing. It amused him a little to think Eugene was having such a hard time. It wouldn't hurt him for a change, would do him good. "When he gets 4 carried up, let him go," he said to Thompson, however, feeling that he had best lighten the situation a little. The latter watched Eugene out of the tail of his eye, noting the grimaces he made and the strain he was undergoing, but he merely smiled. When 4 had been dropped on the floor, he said, "That'll do for the present," and Eugene, heaving a groan of relief, went angrily away. In his nervous, fantastic, imaginative, and apprehensive frame of mind, he imagined that he had been injured for life. He feared he had strained a muscle or broken a blood vessel somewhere. "Good heavens, I can't stand anything like this," he thought. "If the work is going to be this hard, I'll have to quit. I wonder what they mean by treating me this way. I didn't come here to do this." Visions of days and weeks of back-breaking toil stretched before him. It would never do. He couldn't stand it. He saw his old search for work coming back, and this frightened him in another direction. "I mustn't give up so easily," he counseled himself, in spite of his distress. "I have to stick this out a little while, anyhow." It seemed in this first trying hour as though he were between the devil and the deep sea. He went slowly down into the yard to find Jeffords and Duncan. They were working at a car, one inside receiving lumber to be piled, the other bringing it to him. "Get down, Bill," said John, who was on the ground, looking up at his partner indifferently. "You get up there, new man. What's your name?" "Witla," said Eugene. "Well, my name's Duncan. We'll bring the stuff to you and you pile it." It was more heavy lumber, as Eugene apprehensively observed. Quarter-cut joists for some building, 4x4s they called them, but after he was shown the art of handling them, they were not unmanageable. There were methods of sliding and balancing them which relieved him of a great quantity of labor. Eugene had not thought to provide himself with gloves, though, and his hands were being cruelly torn. He stopped once to pick a splinter out of his thumb, and Jeffords, who was coming up, asked, "Ain't you got no gloves?" "No," said Eugene. "I didn't think to get any." "Your hands will get pretty well bunged up, I'm afraid. Maybe Joseph will let you have his for today. You might go in and ask him." "Where's Joseph?" asked Eugene. "He's inside there. He's taking from the plane." Eugene did not understand this quite. He knew what a plane was, had been listening to it sing mightily all the morning, the shavings flying as it smoothed the boards. But taking? "Where's Joseph?" he asked of the plane driver. He nodded his head to a tall, hump-shouldered boy of perhaps 22. He was a big, simple, innocent-looking fellow. His face was long and narrow, his mouth wide, his eyes a watery blue, his hair a shock of brown, loose and wavy, with a good sprinkling of sawdust in it. About his waist was a big piece of hemp bagging tied by a grass rope. He wore an old faded wool cap with a long visor in order to shield his eyes from the flying chips and dust, and when Eugene came in one hand was lifted protectively to shield his eyes. Eugene approached him deprecatingly. "One of the men out in the yard said you might have a pair of gloves you would lend me for today. I'm piling lumber and it's tearing my hands. I forgot to get a pair." "Sure," said Joseph genially, waving his hand to the driver to stop. "They're over here in my locker. I know what that is. I've been there. When I come here they rubbed it into me just as they're doing to you. Don't you mind. You'll come out all right. Up here for your health, are you? It ain't always like that. Some days there ain't most nothing to do here. Then some days again there's a whole lot. Well, it's good, healthy work, I can say that. I ain't most never sick. Nice fresh air we get here, and all that." He rambled on, fumbling under his bagging apron for his keys, unlocking his locker, and producing a great pair of old yellow lumber gloves. He gave them to Eugene cheerfully, and the latter thanked him. He liked Eugene at once, and Eugene liked him. "A nice fellow that," he said, as he went back to his car. "Think of how genial he gave me these. Lovely. If only all men were as genial and kindly disposed as this boy, how nice the world would be." He put on the gloves and found his work instantly easier, for he could grasp the joists firmly and without pain. He worked on until noon, when the whistle blew, and he ate a dreary lunch sitting by himself on one side, pondering. After one, he was called to carry shavings, one basket after another, back through the blacksmith shop to the engine room in the rear, where there was a big shaving bin. By 4 o'clock he had seen almost all the characters he was going to associate with for the time that he stayed there. Henry Forms, the blacksmith, or the village smith, as Eugene came to call him later on, Jimmy Sudds, the blacksmith's helper, or maid of all work, as he promptly named him, John Peters, the engineer, Malachi Dempsey, the driver of the great plane, Joseph Muse, and, in addition, carpenters, tinsmiths, plumbers, painters, and those few exceptional cabinet makers who passed through the lower floor now and then, men who were about the place from time to time and away from it at others, all of whom took note of Eugene at first as a curiosity. Eugene was himself intensely interested in the men. Harry Forms and Jimmy Sudds attracted him especially. The former was an undersized American of distant Irish extraction, who was so broad-chested, swollen-armed, square-jawed, and generally self-reliant and forceful as to seem a minor Titan. He was remarkably industrious, turning out a great deal of work and beating a piece of iron with a resounding lick which could be heard all about the hills and hollows outside. Jimmy Sudds, his assistant, was like his master, equally undersized, dirty, gnarled, twisted, his teeth showing like a row of yellow snags, his ears standing out like small fans, his eyes askew, but nevertheless with so genial a look in his face as to disarm criticism at once. Everybody liked Jimmy Sudds because he was honest, single-minded, and free of malicious intent. His coat was 3 and his trousers 2 times too large for him, and his shoes were obviously bought at a second-hand store. But he had the vast merit of being a picture. Eugene was fascinated with him. He learned shortly that Jimmy Sudds truly believed that buffaloes were to be shot around Buffalo, New York. John Peters, the engineer, was another character who fixed his attention. John was almost helplessly fat, and was known for this reason as Big John. He was a veritable whale of a man, 6 feet tall, weighing over 300 pounds, and standing these summer days in his hot engine room, his shirt off, his suspenders down, his great welts of fat showing through his thin cotton undershirt, he looked as though he might be suffering, but he was not. John, as Eugene soon found out, did not take life emotionally. He stood mostly in his engine room door, when the shade was there, staring out on the glistening water of the river, occasionally wishing that he didn't need to work, but could lie and sleep indefinitely instead. "Would you think them fellows would feel pretty good sitting out there on the poop deck of them there yachts smoking their perfectos?" he once asked Eugene, apropos of the magnificent private vessels that passed up and down the river. "I certainly would," laughed Eugene. "Ah-ha! That's the life for your Uncle Dudley. I could do that there with any of 'em. Ah-ha!" Eugene laughed joyously. "Yes, that's the life," he said. "We could all stand our share." Malachi Dempsey, the driver of the great plane, was dull, tight-mouthed, silent, more from lack of ideas than anything else, though oyster-wise he had learned to recede from all manner of harm by closing his shell tightly. He knew no way to avoid earthly harm save by being preternaturally silent, and Eugene saw this quickly. He used to stare at him for long periods of time, marveling at the curiosity his attitude presented. Eugene himself, though, was a curiosity to the others, even more so than they to him. He did not look like a working man, and could not be made to do so.
His spirit was too high, his eye too flashing and incisive. He smiled at himself, carrying basketful after basketful of shavings from the planing room, where it rained shavings, and from which, because of the lack of a shaving blower, they had to be removed back to the hot engine room where Big John presided. The latter took a great fancy to Eugene, but something after a fashion of a dog for a master. He did not have a single idea above his engine, his garden, at home, his wife, his children, and his pipe. These, and sleep, lots of it, were his joys, his recreations, the totality of his world. End of section 49. Section 50 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 21. There were many days now, 3 months all told, in which Eugene obtained insight into the workaday world such as he had not previously had. It is true he had worked before in somewhat this fashion, but his Chicago experience was without the broad philosophic insight which had come to him since. Formerly the hierarchies of power in the universe and on earth were inexplicable to him, all out of order, but here, where he saw by degrees ignorant, almost animal intelligence being directed by greater, shrewder, and at times it seemed to him possibly malicious intelligence, he was not quite sure about that, who were so strong that the weaker ones must obey them. He began to imagine that in a rough way life might possibly be ordered to the best advantage even under this system. It was true that men quarreled here with each other as to who should be allowed to lead. There was here, as elsewhere, great seeking for the privilege and honors of direction and leadership in such petty things as the proper piling of lumber, the planing of boards, the making of desks and chairs, and men were grimly jealous of their talents and abilities in these respects. But in the main it was the jealousy that makes for ordered, intelligent control. All were striving to do the work of intelligence, not of unintelligence. Their pride, however ignorant it might be, was in the superior, not the inferior. They might complain of their work, snarl at each other, snarl at their bosses, but after all it was because they were not able or permitted to do the higher work and carry out the orders of the higher mind. All were striving to do something in a better way, a superior way, and to obtain the honors and emoluments that come from doing anything in a superior way. If they were not rewarded according to their estimate of their work, there was wrath and opposition and complaint and self-pity. But the work of the superior intelligence was the thing which each in his blind, self-seeking way was apparently trying to do. Because he was not so far out of his troubles that he could be forgetful of them, and because he was not at all certain that his talent to paint was ever coming back to him, he was not as cheerful at times as he might have been. But he managed to conceal it pretty well. This one thought, with its intended ills of probable poverty and obscurity, were terrible to him. Time was slipping away and youth. But when he was not thinking of this, he was cheerful enough. Besides, he had the ability to simulate cheerfulness even when he did not feel it. Because he did not permanently belong to this world of day labor, and because his position, which had been given him as a favor, was moderately secure, he felt superior to everything about him. He did not wish to show this feeling in any way, was very anxious as a matter of fact to conceal it. But his sense of superiority and ultimate indifference to all these petty details was an abiding thought with him. He went to and fro carrying a basket of shavings, jesting with the village smith, making friends with Big John the engineer, with Joseph, Malachi Dempsey, little Jimmy Sudds, in fact anyone and everyone who came near him who would be friends. He took a pencil one day at the noon hour and made a sketch of Harry Farnes, the blacksmith, his arm upraised at the anvil, his helper, Jimmy Sudds, standing behind him, the fire glowing in the forge. Farnes, who was standing beside him, looking over his shoulder, could scarcely believe his eyes.
"What's you doing?" he asked Eugene curiously, looking over his shoulder, for it was at the blacksmith's table in the sun of his window that he was sitting, looking out at the water. Eugene had bought a lunch box and was carrying with him daily a delectable lunch put up under Mrs. Hibberdell's direction. He had eaten his noonday meal and was idling, thinking over the beauty of the scene, his peculiar position, the curiosities of this shop, anything and everything that came into his head. "Wait a minute," he said genially, for he and the smith were already as thick as thieves. The latter gazed interestedly and finally exclaimed, "Why, that's me, ain't it?" "Yes," said Eugene. "What are you going to do with that when you get through with it?" asked the latter avariciously. "I'm going to give it to you, of course." "Say, I'm much obliged for that," replied the smith delightedly. "Gee, the wife'll be tickled to see that. You're an artist, aren't you? I heard them fellows. I never saw one. Gee, that's good. That looks just like me, don't it?" "Something," said Eugene quietly, still working. The helper came in. "What's you doing?" he asked. "He's drawing a picture, you rube. What you suppose he's doing?" informed the blacksmith authoritatively. "Don't get too close. He's got to have room." "Aw, who's crowding?" asked the helper irritably. He realized at once that his superior was trying to shove him in the background, this being a momentous occasion. He did not propose that any such thing should happen. The blacksmith glared at him irritably, but the progress of the artwork was too exciting to permit any immediate opportunities for hostilities. So Jimmy was allowed to crowd close and see. "Ho, ho, that's you, ain't it?" he asked the smith curiously, indicating with a grimy thumb the exact position of that dignitary on the drawing. "Don't," said the latter loftily. "Sure, he's got to have room." "Ah, there's me. Ho, ho. Gee, I look swell, don't I? Ho, ho." The little helper's tushes were showing joyously, a smile that extended far about either side of his face. He was entirely unconscious of the rebuke administered by the smith. "If you're perfectly good, Jimmy," observed Eugene cheerfully, still working, "I may make a sketch of you sometime." "Naw, will you? Go on. Say, Hully gee, that'll be fine, won't it? Say, ho, ho, the folks at home won't know me. I'd like to have a thing like that, say." Eugene smiled. The smith was regretful. This dividing of honors was not quite all that it might be. Still, his own picture was delightful. It looked exactly like the shop. Eugene worked until the whistle blew and the belts began to slap and the wheels to whir. Then he got up. "There you are, Fornes," he said. "Like it?" "Gee, it's swell," said the latter, and carried it to the locker. He took it out after a bit, though, and hung it up over his bench on the wall opposite his forge, for he wanted everyone to see. It was one of the most significant events in his life. This sketch was the subject immediately of a perfect storm of discussion. Eugene was an artist, could draw pictures. That was a revelation in itself. Then this picture was so lifelike. It looked like Fornes and Sudds and the shop. Everyone was interested, everyone jealous. They could not understand how God had favored the smith in this manner. Why hadn't Eugene sketched them before he did him? Why didn't he immediately offer to sketch them now? Big John came first, tipped off and piloted by Jimmy Sudds. "Say," he said, his big round eyes popping with surprise, "there's some class to that, what?" "That looks like you, Fornes. Jingles if it don't. And Sudsy, bless me if there ain't Sudsy. Say, there you are, kid. Natural as life. Damned if you ain't. That's fine. You ought to keep that, Smith." "I intend to," said the latter proudly. Big John went back to his engine room regretfully. Next came Joseph Mews, his shoulders humped, his head bobbing like a duck, for he had this habit of nodding when he walked. "Say, what you think of that?" he asked. "Ain't that fine? He can draw just as good as they do in them there magazines. I see them there things in them now and then. Ain't that swell? Look at Sudsy back there. Huh, Sudsy? You're in right, all right. I wish he'd make a picture of us out there. We're just as good as you people. What's the matter with us?" "Oh, he ain't going to be bothered making pictures of you mucks," replied the smith jestingly. "He only draws real ones." "You want to remember that, Mews. He's got to have good people to make sketches of. None of your half-class plane drivers and jigsaw operators."
"Is that so? Is that so?" replied Joseph contemptuously, his love of humor spurred by the slight cast upon his ability. "Well, if he was looking for real ones he made a mistake when he come here. They're all up front. You don't want to forget that, Smith. They don't live in no blacksmith shop, as I'd ever seen it." "Cut it out! Cut it out!" called little Sudds from a position of vantage near the door. "Here comes the boss." And Joseph immediately pretended to be going to the engine room for a drink. The smith blew up his fire as though it were necessary to heat the iron he had laid in the coals. Jack Stix came ambling by. "Who did that?" he asked, stopping after a single general glance and looking at the sketch on the wall. "Mr. Witla, the new man," replied the smith reverently. "Say, that's pretty good, ain't it?" the foreman replied pleasantly. "He did that well. He must be an artist." "I think he is," replied the smith cautiously. He was always eager to curry favor with the boss. He came near to his side and looked over his arm. "He done it here today at noon, in about half an hour." "Say, that's pretty good now," and the foreman went on his way, thinking, if Eugene could do that, why was he here? It must be his run-down condition, sure enough, and he must be the friend of someone high in authority. He had better be civil. Hitherto he had stood in suspicious awe of Eugene, not knowing what to make of him. He could not figure out just why he was here, a spy possibly. Now he thought that he might be mistaken. "Don't let him work too hard," he told Bill and John. "He ain't any too strong yet. He came up here for his health." He was obeyed in this respect, for there was no gainsaying the wishes of a foreman. But this open plea for consideration was the one thing, if any, which could have weakened Eugene's popularity. The men did not like the foreman. He would have been stronger at any time in the affections of the men if the foreman had been less markedly considerate or against him entirely. The days which followed were restful enough, though hard, for Eugene found that the constant whirl of work which went on here, and which he had naturally to do his share, was beneficial to him. For the first time in several years he slept soundly. He would don a suit of blue overalls and jumper in the morning a few minutes before the whistle blew at 7, and from then on until noon, and from 1 o'clock until 6, he would carry shavings, pile lumber for one or several of the men in the yard, load or unload cars, help Big John stoke his broilers, or carry chips and shavings from the second floor. He wore an old hat which he had found in a closet at Mrs. Hibberdell's, a faded, crumpled memory of a soft tan-colored sombrero which he punched jauntily to a peak and wore over one ear. He had big new yellow gloves which he kept on his hands all day, which were creased and frayed, but plenty good enough for this shop and yard. He learned to handle lumber nicely, to pile with skill, to take for Malachi Dempsey from the plane, to drive the jigsaw and other curious bits. He was tireless in his energy because he was weary of thinking, and hoped by sheer activity to beat down and overcome his notion of artistic inability, to forget that he believed that he couldn't paint, and so be able to paint again. He had surprised himself in these sketches he had made, for his first feeling under the old regime would have been that he could not make them. Here, because the men were so eager, and he was so much applauded, he found it rather easy, and, strange to say, he thought they were good. At the home of Mrs. Hibberdell at night, he would lay off all his working clothes before dinner, take a cold bath, and don a new brown suit, which, because of the assurance of this position, he had bought for $18, ready-made. He found it hard to get off to buy anything, for his pay ceased, 15 cents an hour, the moment he left the shop. He had put his pictures in storage in New York and could not get off, or at least did not want to take the time off, to go and sell any. He found that he could leave without question if he wanted no pay, but if he wanted pay, and had a good reason, he could sometimes be excused. His appearance about the house and yard after 6:30 in the evening and on Sundays was attractive enough. He looked delicate, refined, conservative, and when not talking to someone, rather wistful. He was lonely and restless, for he felt terribly out of it. This house was lonely. As at Alexandria, before he met Frieda, he was wishing there were some girls about. He wondered where Frieda was, what she was doing, whether she had married. He hoped not. If life had only given him a girl like Frieda, so young, so beautiful, he would sit and gaze at the water after dark in the moonlight, for this was his one consolation, the beauty of nature, thinking. How lovely it all was! How lovely life was! This village, the summer trees, the shop where he worked, the water, Joseph, little Jimmy, Big John, the stars. If he could paint again, if he could be in love again, in love, in love, was there any other sensation in the world like that of being in love? A spring evening, say, some soft sweet odors blowing as they were tonight, the dark trees bending down, or the twilight angelically silver, hyacinth, orange, some soothing murmurs of the wind, some faint chirping of the tree toads or frogs, and then your girl. Dear God, could anything be finer than that? Was anything else in life worth while? Your girl, her soft young arms about your neck, her lips to yours in pure love, her eyes speaking like twin pools of color here in the night. So it had been only a little while ago with Frieda. So it had been once with Angela. So long ago with Stella. Dear sweet Stella. How nice she was. And now here he was sick and lonely and married, and Angela would be coming back soon, and he would get up frequently to shut out these thoughts and either read or walk or go to bed. But he was lonely, almost irritably so. There was only one true place for comfort for Eugene anywhere, and that was in the springtime in love. End of section 50.